Chapter 1 of the Travelling Thirds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. The Travelling Thirds by Gertrude Atherton. Chapter 1. The California cousin of the Lyman T. Moultons, a name too famous to be shorn, stood apart from the perturbed group, her feet boyishly asunder, her head thrown back. Above her hung the thick white clusters of the acacia, drooping abundantly, opaque and luminous in the soft masses of green, heavy with perfume. All Lyons seemed to have yielded itself to the intoxicating fragrance of its favourite tree. In the Place Carnot, at least, there was not a murmur. The Moultons had hushed in thought their 4 variations on the aggressive American key, although perhaps insensible to the voluptuous offering of the grove. Mrs. Moulton, had her senses responded to the sweet and drowsy afternoon, would have resented the experience as immoral, and as it was her pale blue gaze rested disapprovingly on the rapt figure of her husband's second cousin. The short skirt and the covert coat of ungraceful length, its low pockets always inviting the hands of its owner, had roused more than once her futile protest, and to–day they seemed to hang limp with a sense of incongruity beneath the half–closed eyes and expanded nostrils of the young Californian. It was not possible for nature to struggle triumphant through the disguise this beneficiary chose to assume, but there was an unwilling conviction in the Moulton family that when Catalina arrayed herself as other women she would blossom forth into something of a beauty. Even her stiff hat half covered her brow and rich brown hair, but her eyes, long and dark and far apart, rarely failed to arrest other eyes, immobile as was their common expression. Always independent of her fellow–mortals, and peculiarly of her present companions, she was a happy pagan at the moment, and meditating a solitary retreat to another grove of acacias down by the Saône, when her attention was claimed by Mr. Moulton. "Would you mind coming here a moment, Catalina?" he asked, in a voice whose roll and cadence told that he had led a family in prayers these many years, if not in meeting. "After all, it is your suggestion, and I think you should present the case. I have done it very badly, but they don't seem inclined to listen to me." He smiled apologetically, but there was a faint twinkle in his eye which palliated the somewhat sanctimonious expression of the lower part of his face. Blond and cherubic in youth, his countenance had grown in dignity as time changed its tints to drab and grey, reclaimed the superfluous flesh of his face, and drew the strong lines that are the half of a man's good looks. He, too, had his hands in his pockets, and he stood in front of his wife and daughters, who sat on a bench in the perfumed shade of the acacias. His cousin once removed dragged down her eyes and scowled, without attempt at dissimulation. In a moment, however, she came forward with a manifest attempt to be human and normal. Mrs. Moulton stiffened her spine as if awaiting an assault, and her oldest daughter, a shade more formal and correct, more afraid of doing the wrong thing, fixed a cold and absent eye upon the Statue of Liberty in the centre of the place. Only the second daughter, Lydia, just departing from her first quarter–century, turned to the alien relative with a sparkle in her eye. She was a girl about whose pink and white and gold prettiness there was neither question nor enthusiasm, and her thin graceful figure and alertly poised head received such enhancement as her slender purse afforded. She wore, need I record it, a travelling–suit of dark blue brilliantine, short, but at least 3 inches longer than Catalina's, and a large hat about whose brim fluttered a blue veil. She admired and a little feared the recent acquisition from California, experiencing for the first time in her life a pleasing suspense in the vagaries of an unusual character. She, and all that hitherto pertained to her, belonged to that highly refined middle class nowhere so formal and exacting as in the land of the free. Catalina, who never permitted her relatives to suspect that she was shy, assumed her most stolid expression and abrupt tones. It is simple enough. We can go to Spain if we travel third class, and we can't if we don't. I want to see Spain more than any country in Europe. I have heard you say more than once that you were wild to see it, the Alhambra and all that. Well, anxious then," as Mrs. Moulton raised a protesting eyebrow. "I'm wild, if you like. I'd walk, go on mule–back. In short, I'll go alone if you won't take me." "You will do what?" The colour came to Mrs. Moulton's faded cheek, and she squared herself as for an encounter. Open friction was infrequent, for Mrs. Moulton was nothing if not diplomatic, and Catalina was indifferent. Nevertheless, encounters there had been, and at the finish the Californian had invariably held the middle of the field, insolent and victorious. And Mrs. Moulton had registered a vow that sooner or later she would wave the colours over the prostrate foe. For 32 years she had submerged her individuality, but in these last 4 months she had been possessed by a waxing revolt of an almost passionate desire for a victorious moment. It was her first trip abroad, and she had followed where her energetic husband and daughters listed. Hardly once had she been consulted. Perhaps, removed for the first time from the stultifying environment of habit, she had come to realize what slight rewards are the woman's who flings her very soul at the feet of others. It was too late to attempt to be an individual in her own family. Even did she find the courage, she must continue to accept their excessive care. She had a mild form of invalidism, and endeavour to feel grateful that she was owned by the kindest of husbands, and daughters no more selfish than the average. But since the advent of Catalina, all the rebellion left in her had become compact and alert. Here was an utterly antagonistic temperament, one beyond her comprehension, individual in a fashion that offended every sensibility, cool, wary, insolently suggesting that she purposed to stalk through life in that hideous get–up, pursuing the unorthodox. She was not only indomitable youth, but indomitable savagery, and Mrs. Moulton, of the old and cold Eastern civilization, bristled with a thrill that was almost rapture when this unwelcome relative of her husband stared at her with contemptuous silence. "You will do what? The suggestion that we travel third class is offensive enough, but you are aware that Spanish women never travel even first class alone." "I don't see what that has to do with me. I'm not Spanish. They would assume that I was no lady, and take no further notice of me, or if they did, well, I can take care of myself. As for travelling third class, I can't see that it is any more undignified than travelling second, and its chief recommendations, after its cheapness, are that it won't be so deadly respectable as second, and that we'll meet nice, dirty, picturesque, excitable peasants instead of dowdy, middle–class people who want all the windows shut. The third–class carriages are generally big open cars like ours, with wooden seats, no microbes, and at this time of the year all the windows will be open. Now you can think it over. I am going to invest 20 francs in a Baedeker and study my route." She nodded to Mr. Moulton, dropped an almost imperceptible eyelash at Lydia, and, ignoring the others, strode off belligerently towards the Place Bellecour. Mrs. Moulton turned white. She set her lips. "I shall not go," she announced. "My love," protested her husband, mildly, "I am afraid she has placed us in a position where we shall have to go." He was secretly delighted. "Spain, as you justly remarked, is the most impossible country in Europe for the woman alone, and she is the child of my dead cousin and old college chum. When we are safely home again, I shall have a long talk with her, and arrive at a definite understanding of this singular character. But over here I cannot permit her to make herself and us notorious. I am sure you will agree with me, my love. My only fear is that you may find the slow trains and wooden seats fatiguing, although I shall buy an extra supply of air–cushions, and we will get off whenever you feel tired." "Do say yes, mother," pleaded her youngest–born. "It will almost be an adventure, and I've never had anything approaching an adventure in my life. I'm sure even Jane will enjoy it." "I loathe travelling," said the elder Miss Moulton, with energy. "It's nothing but reading Baedeker, stalking through churches and picture galleries, and rushing for trains, loaded down with hand baggage. I feel as if I never wanted to see another thing in my life. Of course I'm glad I've seen London and Paris and Rome, but the discomforts and privations of travel far outweigh the advantages. I haven't the slightest desire to see Spain, or any more down-at-heel European countries. America will satisfy me for the rest of my life. As for travelling third class, the very idea is low and horrid. It is bad enough to travel second, and if we did think so little of ourselves as to travel third, just think of its being found out! Where would our social position be? Father's great influence. As for that California savage, the mere fact that she makes a suggestion—" "My dear," remonstrated her father, "Catalina is a most well–conducted young woman. She has not given me a moment of anxiety, and I think her suggestion a really opportune one, for it will enable us to see Spain, and give me much valuable literary material. Of course I do not like the idea of travelling third class myself, and I only wish I could afford to take you all in the train de luxe." "You are a perfect dear," announced Lydia, "and give us everything we want. And if we went in the luxe we couldn't see any nice little out–of–the–way places, and would soon become blasé, which would be dreadful. Jane at first enjoyed it as much as we did, and I could go on for ever. No one ever need know that we went third, and when we are at home we will have something else to talk about except the everlasting Italy and England and Paris. Do consent, mother." This was an unusual concession, and Mrs. Moulton was a trifle mollified. Besides, if her favourite child's heart was set upon Spain, that dyed the matter with a different complexion. She could defer her subjection of the Californian, and, tired as she was by no means averse to seeing Spain herself. Nevertheless, she rose with dignity, and gathered her cape about her. "You and your father will settle the matter to suit yourselves," she said, with that access of politeness with which the down–trodden manifest their sense of injury. "But I have no hesitation in saying that I never before heard a gentlewoman"—she had the true middle–class horror of the word "lady"—"express a desire to travel third, and I think it will be a most unbecoming performance. Moreover, I doubt if anything can make us comfortable. We are reasonably sure to become infested with vermin, and made ill by the smell of garlic. I have had my say, however, and shall now go and lie down." As she moved up the path, her step measured, her spine protestant, her husband ran after her and drew her arm through his. He nodded over his shoulder to his youngest daughter, and Lydia, deprecating further argument, went swiftly off in search of Catalina. Chapter 2 of the Travelling Thirds, by Gertrude Atherton. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2. "Let us get out and race it," suggested Catalina, but she spoke with the accent of indolent content, and hung over the door of the leisurely train, giving no heed beyond a polite nod to the nervous protests of Mrs. Moulton. That good lady, surrounded by air–cushions, which the various members of her attentive family distended at stated intervals, had propped herself in a corner, determined to let no expression of fatigue escape her, and enjoying herself in her own fashion. The material discomforts of travel certainly overbalanced the aesthetic delights, but, at least, she was seeing the Europe she had dreamed of so ardently in her youth. Jane sat in another corner reading a volume of Pater. It was impossible to turn her back on the scenery, for the seats ran from east to west, and they were travelling due south. But she could ignore it, and that she did. They were in a large open car, furnished with wooden seats, and a door for each aisle. The carriage was not dirty, and all the windows were open. Moreover, it harboured so far no natives beyond 2 nuns and a priest, who ate cherries continually, and talked all at once with the rapidity of ignited fire–crackers, and with no falling inflection. The Moultons had taken possession of the last compartment and sat with their backs to the wall, but Catalina, disdaining such poor apology for comfort, had the next to herself, and when not hanging over the door, rambled back and forth. Mr. Moulton and Lydia alternately read Baedeker and leaned forward with exclamations of approval. But although Catalina had responded amiably to Lydia's expression of contempt for Spanish methods of transit, the ambling train suited her less energetic nature, and enabled her to study the country that had mothered her own. She stared hard at the blue and tumbled masses of the Pyrenees with their lofty fields of snow glittering in a delicate mist, the same frozen solitude through which Hannibal marched 2000 years ago, longing perhaps for the hot, brown plain of Ampurdan below and the familiar murmur of the bright waters that rimmed it. The sun was hot, and all that quivering world of blue shimmered and sparkled and coquetted as if life and death were its bridegroom. But the Mediterranean, like other seas, is a virago at heart, and only dances and sways like a Spanish beauty when out where there is naught to oppose her. For centuries she has been snarling and clawing the rocky headlands, her white fangs never failing to capture their daily morsel, and never content. Catalina loved the sea and hated it. To–day she was in no mood to give it anything, and turned her back upon it, her eyes travelling from the remote disdainful beauty of the mountains down over the vineyards and villages, leaning far out to catch a last glimpse of that most characteristic object in a Spanish landscape, a huge and almost circular mass of rock rising abruptly from the plain, brown, barren, its apex set with a fortified castle, an old brown town clinging desperately to the inhospitable sides. The castle may be in ruins, but men and women still crawl lazily up and down the perpendicular streets, too idle or too poor to get away from the soil, with its dust of ancestral blood. The descendants of warriors slept and loafed and begged in the sun, thankful for a tortilla a day, and dreading nothing this side of judgment but the visit of the tax–gatherer. To escape the calls of the remorseless one, many who owned not even a little vineyard on the plain, slept in the hollow side of a hill and made the earth their pillow. "Brutes!" said Catalina, meaning the government. "Why don't they come to America?" asked Lydia, wonderingly. "Look at that old woman out in the field. That is the most shocking thing you see in Europe, women in the fields everywhere." Catalina, indolent in some respects, waged eternal war with the one–sided. "Your factories are far worse," she asserted. "They are really horrible, for the women stand on their feet all day, with a ceaseless din tearing at their nerves, and never a breath of decent air in their lungs. They are the most ghastly lot I ever saw in my life. These women are always in the fresh air, with a quiet of nature about them, and they rest when they like. I think we are the barbarians, we and the Spanish government." "Well, well, don't argue," said Mr. Moulton, soothingly. "It is too hot. We have our defects, but don't forget our many redeeming virtues. And as for Spain, backward, tax–ridden, oppressed as she is, one sees nothing to compare with the horrors that Arthur Young saw in France just before 1789. Spain, no doubt, will have her own revolution in her own time. I am told the peasants are very virile and independent. My love, shall I blow up that bag behind your head?" He examined the other bags, readjusted them, and there being nothing to claim the eye at the moment, read Baedeker aloud, to the intense but respectful annoyance of his eldest daughter, and the barely concealed resentment of Catalina, who hung still farther over the creaking door. The train walked into a little station of Tordera and stopped. "Cinco minutos," said the guard, raising his voice. "5," said Catalina. "That means 15. Let us get out and exercise, and buy something." "Pray be careful," exclaimed Mrs. Moulton. "I know you will be left. Mr. Moulton, please, please don't get out." Mr. Moulton patted her amiably, and descended in the wake of Catalina and Lydia. They were surrounded at once by beggars, even the babies in arms extending their hands. There were few men among them, but the women, picturesque enough in their closely pinned kerchiefs of red and yellow, were more pertinacious than man ever dared to be. Lydia, fastidious and economical, retreated into the train and closed the door, but Catalina dispersed coppers and gave one dirty little Murillo a peseta. She had spoken almost as much Spanish in her life as English, and exchanged so many elaborate compliments with her retinue in a manner so acceptable to their democratic taste, that they forgot to beg and pressed close at her heels as she strode up and down, her hands in her pockets, wondering what manner of fallen princess was this who travelled third class and knew how to treat a haughty peasant of Spain as her equal. She was buying an inflammable looking novel with which to insult Jane, and a package of sweets for Lydia and herself, when she heard a shrill note of anguish. "Mr. Moulton! Catalina!" Mingling with it was the drone of the guard. "Viajeros al tren!" The train was moving, the guard having been occupied at the cantina until the last moment. He was singing his song unconsciously on the step of an open door. Catalina saw the frantic whir of Mr. Moulton's coat tails as he flew by and leaped into the car. She flung 2 pesetas at the anxious vendor, dropped her purchase into her pockets, and, running swiftly alongside the moving train, made the door easily. "I could have caught the old thing if it had been half a mile off," she exclaimed indignantly, as 3 pairs of hands jerked her within, and Mrs. Moulton sniffed hysterically at her salts. "And if ever I do get left, just remember that I speak the language and am not afraid of anything." "Well," said Mr. Moulton, tactfully, "just remember that we do not speak the language and have need of your services. Suppose we have our afternoon meal. The lunch at the frontier was not all that could be desired." He produced the hamper, and neatly arrayed the top of 2 portmanteaus with jam and bread and cake. Catalina placed a generous share of these delicacies on a tin plate, and, omitting to explain to her astonished relatives, climbed over the seats and made offering to each of the other occupants of the car. It had half filled at the station, and besides the nuns and priests there were now several Catalan peasants in red caps and black velvet breeches, fine, independent men, prepared to ignore these eccentric Americans, ready to take offence at the slightest suggestion of superiority, but enchanted at the act of this unsmiling girl, who spoke their language and understood their customs. They refused, as a matter of course, politely, without servility, and in a moment she returned to her party. "You must always do that," she informed them, as she set her teeth hungrily into the bread, "and when they offer of theirs, you must look pleased with the attention." Mrs. Moulton sighed, and when, a few moments later, a peasant vaulted over the seats and proudly offered of his store of black bread and garlic, she buried a frozen smile in her smelling salts. Jane refused to notice him, but the other 3 declined with such professions of gratitude that he told his comrades the Americans were not altogether a contemptible race, and that the one who spoke their language looked like a devil with a white soul, and was worthy to have been born in Spain. He took out his guitar in a moment and swept the keys with superb grace while the others sang, the nuns in high, quavering voices that wandered aimlessly through the rich tones of the men. After that they talked politics, and became so excited that Mr. Moulton was relieved when they all fell out together at Mataro. He could then take notes and enjoy the groves of olives and oranges, the castles and watch–towers on the heights, eloquent and Iberian and Roman, Goth and Moor, the turquoise surface of the Mediterranean, never so blue as the Adriatic or the Caribbean, the bold, harsh sweep of the coast. Then, as even Catalina began to change her position frequently on the hard seats, and they were all so covered with dust that even the spinster visage of Jane looked like a study in grotesque, the horizon gave up the palaces and palms of Barcelona. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of The Travelling Thirds, by Gertrude Atherton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Chapter 3. 23 years before the opening of this desultory tale, Its heroine was born on the island of Santa Catalina, a fragment of Southern California. Her father had begun life as a professor of classics in a worthy Eastern college, but, his health breaking down, he betook himself and his small patrimony to the state which electrifies the nerves in its northern half and blunts them in its southern. Jonathan Shore wrote to his cousin, Lyman T. Moulton: "I haven't a nerve left with a point on it, have recovered some measure of health, and lost what little ambition I ever possessed. I am going to open an inn for sportsmen on the island of Santa Catalina, so that I shall be reasonably sure of the society of gentlemen, and make enough money to replenish my library now and then. My books are on the way. Here I remain for the rest of my natural life." But he crossed over to Los Angeles occasionally. At a soirée he met the daughter and only child of one of the largest landholders in Southern California, and danced with no one else that night. She married the scholarly innkeeper with the blessing of her father, who was anxious to pass his declining years in peace with a young wife. The bride, for coincident if not similar reasons, was glad to move to Catalina. She was the belle of her time, this Madelena Joyce, and her dark beauty came down to her from Indian ancestors. Her New England great-grandfather had come to California long before the discovery of gold, bought for a fraction 200,000 acres from the Mexican government, and married, despite the protests of his Spanish friends, an Indian girl of great beauty, both of face and character. The Pueblo bride had lived but 2 years to receive the snubs of the haughty ladies of Santa Barbara. Her ardent young husband had shot himself over her grave, and the boy was brought up by the padres of the mission. Fortunately he came to man's estate shortly before the United States occupation, and managed to save a portion of his patrimony from the most rapacious set of scoundrels that ever followed in the wake of a victorious army. This in turn descended to his son, who, in spite of Southern indolence and a hospitality as famous as his cellar, his liberal appreciation of all the good things of life, and a half-dozen lawsuits, still retained 50,000 of the ancestral acres, and had given his word to his daughter that they should go to her unencumbered. This promise he kept, and when Catalina was 10 years old he died, at good will with all the world. His widow moved to San Francisco with her freedom and her liberal portion, and Mrs. Shore announced that she must give the ranch her personal attention. The 10 years had been happy, for the husband and wife loved each other and were equally devoted to their beautiful unsmiling baby. But there were deep wells of laughter in Mrs. Shore, and much energy. She wept for her father, but welcomed the change in her life, not only because she had reached the age when love of change is most insistent, but because she had begun to dread the hour of confession that life on an island, even with the man of one's choice, was insufficient. Mr. Shore himself was not averse to change, so long as it did not take him out of California, although he refused to sell the little property on the island where he had spent so many happy years. From the hour Mrs. Shore settled down in the splendid old adobe ranch house she watched no more days lag through her fingers. Attended by Catalina, she rode over some portion of the estate every day, and if a horse had strayed or a cow had calved she knew it before her indolent vaqueros. She personally attended each year to the sheep shearing and the cattle branding, the crops and the stock sales. Once a year she gave a great barbecue, to which all within a radius of 100 miles were invited, and once a week she indulged herself in the gossip, the shops, and the dances of Santa Barbara. In the vast solitude of the ranch Catalina grew up, carefully educated by her father, petted and indulged by her mother, hiding from the society that sought Mrs. Shore, but friendly with the large army of Mexican and Indian retainers. When she was persuaded by her mother to attend a party in Santa Barbara, she rooted herself in a corner and glowered in her misery, snubbing every adventurous youth that approached her. She adored books, her outdoor life, her parents, and asked for nothing further afield. When she was 18 her father died. She rode to the extreme confines of the ranch and mourned him. returning to her life at home with the stolidity of her Indian ancestors. Mrs. Shore grieved also, but by this time she was too busy a woman to consort with the past. Moreover, she was now at liberty to take Catalina to San Francisco and give her the proper tutors in languages and music. Incidentally, she made many new friends, and enjoyed with all her vivid nature the life of a city which she had visited but twice before. She returned in the following winter and extended her fame as a hostess. Catalina found San Francisco society but little more interesting than that of the South, and enjoyed the reputation of being as rude as she was beautiful. Here, however, her Indian ancestress had her belated revenge. Her brief and tragic story cast a radiant halo about the indifferent Catalina, whose strain of aboriginal blood was extolled as the first cause in a piquant and original beauty. All her quaint eccentricities, which were merely the expression of a proud and reticent nature anxious to be let alone, were traced to the same artless source, and when one day in the Park she sprang from her horse and shook the editor of a personal weekly until his teeth rattled in his head, her unique reputation was secure. The greater part of the year was spent on the ranch. Mrs. Shore loved the world, but she was a woman of business above all things, and determined that the ranch should be a splendid inheritance for her child. Her time was closer than she knew. In all the vigor of her middle years, with the dark radiance of her beauty little dimmed, and an almost pagan love of mere existence, she was done to death by a bucking mustang, unseated for the first time since she had mounted a horse and kicked beyond recognition. Catalina resolutely put the horror of those days behind her, and for several months was as energetic a woman of business as her mother had been. She was mistress of a great tract of land, of herself, her time, her future. When her stoical grief for her mother subsided, she found life interesting and stimulating. She rode about the ranch in the morning, or conferred with her lawyer, who drove out once a week. The afternoon she spent in the great court of the old house, with its stone fountain built by the ancestors who had learned their craft from the mission fathers, its palms and banana trees, its old hollyhocks and roses. Here she read or dreamed vaguely of the future. What she wanted of life beyond this dreaming southern land, where only an earthquake broke the monotony, was as vague of outline as her mountains under their blue mists. But its secrets were a constant and delightful well of perplexity. For 2 years she was contented, and at times, when galloping down to the sea in the early dawn, the old moon, bony and yellow, sinking to its grave in the darkest cañon of the mountain, and the red sun leaping from the sea, she was supremely happy. Then, in a night, discontent settled upon her. She wanted change, variety. She wanted to see the world, Europe above all things. And when her Eastern relatives, with whom she corresponded, in obedience to a last request of her father, again pressed her to visit them, and mentioned that they were contemplating a trip abroad, she started on 3 hours' notice, leaving the ranch in charge of a trusted overseer and the executors of her mother's will. She found her relatives living in a suburb of New York, their social position very different from that her mother had given her in California. Nothing saved them from the narrow routine of the suburban middle class but the intellectual proclivities of Mr. Moulton, who was a reader for a publishing house and the literary adviser of the pseudo-intellectual. Through the constant association of his name with moral and non-sensational fiction, his well-balanced attitude of piety tinctured by humor, the pleasant style with which he indited irreproachable and elevated platitudes, his stern and invariable denunciation of the unorthodox in religion, in ideas, and in style, and his genially didactic habit of telling his readers what they wished to hear, he had achieved the rank of a great critic. As he really was an estimable man and virtuous husband, of agreeable manners, sufficiently hospitable, and extremely careful in choosing his friends, his position in the literary world was quite enviable. The great and the safe took tea on his lawn, and if the great and unsafe laughed at both the tea and the critic, that was the final seal of their unregeneracy. When Catalina arrived, after lingering for a fortnight in Boston with a friend she had made on the train, she liked him at once, unjustly despised Mrs. Moulton, who was the best of wives and copied her husband's manuscripts, hated Jane, and recognized in Lydia a human being in whom one could find a reasonable amount of companionship, in spite of the magnetism of the mirror, or even the polished surface of a panel, for her complacent eyes. Lydia was innocently vain, and, being the beauty of the family, believed herself to be very beautiful indeed. She always made a smart appearance, and was frankly desirous of admiration. Like many family beauties, she had a strong will and was reasonably clever. When the first opportunity to go to Europe arrived, she had reached what she called a critical point in her life. She confided to Catalina that she was becoming morbidly tired of mere existence, and hated the sight of every literary man she knew, particularly the young ones. "Of course they are more or less the respectable hangers-on that give us the benefit of their society," she said gloomily. "Those that scurry about writing little stories for the magazines and weekly papers. It seems to me a real man might find something better to do. We know all the big ones, but they are too busy to come out here often, and father sees them at the Century and Authors' Clubs anyhow. We hardly know a man who isn't a publisher, an editor, or a writer of something or other. Perhaps an occasional artist. For my part, I'd give my immortal soul to be one of those unlucky girls that go to Mrs. Astor's parties. That's my idea of life. If a millionaire would only fall in love with me, or any old romance for that matter." "Have you never been in love?" asked Catalina, afraid of the sound of her own voice, but deeply interested. "Not the least little bit. More is the pity. I wouldn't mind even being heartbroken for a while." It was this frankness that endeared her to Catalina. Jane is third-rate, and tries to conceal the fact from herself and others by an affectation of such of the literary galaxy as make the least appeal to the popular taste, and Cousin Lyman is no critic, she informed herself 3 days after her arrival. Cousin Miranda is just one of those American women who are invalids for no reason but because they want to be, and I suppose even Lydia would get on my nerves in time. Thank heaven, when they do I can leave at a moment's notice." After 4 months of the friction of travel, Catalina had half hoped her relatives would reject her startling proposal and abandon her to a future full of dangers and freedom. Chapter 4 of the Travelling Thirds by Gertrude Atherton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4 She brushed her hair viciously in the solitude of her bedroom in Barcelona. Fortunately, the composition of the party always gave her a room to herself. "To-morrow morning I'll be up and out before they are awake," she announced to her sulky image. "This evening I suppose I must walk with them on the Rambla. Of course, if I had come alone, I should have had to find a chaperon for such occasions, but it would be some quaint old duenna I could hire. I never wanted my liberty as I do here in Spain, and Cousin Lyman will barely let me wash my own face. I never was so taken care of in my life." She ground her teeth, but nodded as Mr. Moulton put his head in at the door and asked her if she was sure she was comfortable, if her room was quite clean, and her keys in proper order. Then he adjured her not to drink the water until he had ascertained its reputation, and to be careful not to lean over the railing of the balcony, as it might be insecure. The Spanish were a shiftless people, so far as his observation of them went. Catalina flung her hair-brush at the door as he pattered down the hall to examine the welfare of his daughters. "I've a mind to go up and dance on the roof," she cried furiously. "One would think I was 4 years old. Papa was just like that when we travelled, and if all American men are the same, I'll marry an Englishman." After dinner, Mr. Moulton, having seen his wife safely into bed, and conscientiously determined to observe every respectable phase of foreign life, drew Lydia's arm within his, and bidding Catalina take Jane's and follow close behind him, went out upon the Rambla. Upon these occasions he always took his youngest carefully under his wing. A wag had once said of her, while commenting upon the infinite respectability of the Lyman T. Moultons, that on a moonlight night, in a boat on a lake, Lydia might develop possibilities. And it may have been some dim appreciation of these possibilities that prompted Mr. Moulton to favour the beauty of the family with more than her share of attention. But Lydia had a coquettish pair of eyes, and under her father's formidable wing had indulged in more than one innocent flirtation. Catalina raged that she was to take her first night's pleasure in Spain in the companionship of Jane, and ignored her protector's mandate. Jane, whose sense of duty increased in proportion to her dislikes, took a firm hold of the Californian's rigid and vertical arm, and marched close upon her father's heels. They promenaded with all Barcelona in the very middle of the Rambla, that splendid avenue of many names above the vaulted bed of the river. For nearly a mile on either side the hotels and cafés and many of the shops and side streets were brilliantly alight. Under the double row of plane trees were kiosks for the sale of newspapers, postcards of the bull–fights, fans, and curios, and passing and repassing were thousands of people. All who were not forced to work this soft southern night strolled there indolently, to take the air, to see, now and again to be seen. Doubtless there were other promenades for the poor, but here all appeared to have come from the houses of the aristocracy or wealthy middle class. Many were the duennas, elderly, stout, or shrunken, always in black, with a bit of lace about the head, immobile and watchful. Perhaps they towed one maiden, but more frequently a party. The girls and young matrons were light and gay of attire. Occasionally their millinery was Parisian, but more often they wore the mantilla or rebosa. Their eyes were bright, demure, inviting, rarely indifferent, and making up the other half of the throng were officers, students, men of the world, murmuring compliments as they passed, or talking volubly of politics and war. Two young aristocrats behind Catalina were laughing over the recent visit of the young king, when, simply by the magic of his boyish personality, eager to please, he had transformed in a moment the most hostile and anarchistic city in his kingdom, determined to show its insolent contempt, into a mob of cheering, hysterical madmen. The socialists and anarchists might be sailing their barks on the hidden river beneath. They were forgotten. The mayor hardly dared to show his face, and the women kissed their fingers to the pictures of the gallant little king hanging on every kiosk. The men lifted their hats. It was the most brilliant and animated picture of outdoor life that Catalina had seen in Europe, and the general air of good breeding, of mingled vivacity and perfect dignity, the picturesque beauty of many of the women, the constant ripple of talk and laughter, the flare of light, and the dim shades of the old trees, appealed powerfully to the girl from the most picturesque portion of the United States, and in whom scenes of mere fashion and frivolity aroused a resentment as passionate as if fed by envy and privation. She had stood one morning not a fortnight since on a corner of the Rue de Rivoli, and watched carriage after carriage, automobile after automobile, roll round the corner of the Place de la Concorde, each framing women in the extravagant uniform of fashion. American women, all come from across the sea for one purpose only, the purpose for which they lived their useless, idle lives, more clothes. For this they spent 2 wretched weeks on the ocean every year. The ship's doctor had told Catalina that the pampered American was the most unheroic sailor on the Atlantic, and they looked unnormal, exotic, mere shining butterflies, whose necks would be twisted with one turn of a strong wrist in the first week of a revolution of which, unindividual as they were, they would be a precipitating cause. But here there was no exotic class, none but legitimate causes of separation from the masses. It was the charming faces one noted, the lively expression of pleasure in mere living. The garments might be Parisian, but, being less than the woman, and worn without consciousness, they barely arrested the eye, and were no part of the picture, as was the mantilla or the rebosa. Catalina for once hated no one in the world, and even became oblivious of the grip on her arm. She looked about her with the wide, curious eyes of youth. Few gave her more than a passing glance, for her stiff hat threw an ugly shadow on her face, and every line of her figure was hidden under her loose coat. But she noticed that Lydia, who in the evening wore a small hat perched coquettishly on her fluffy hair, was receiving audible admiration. Suddenly she glanced out of the corner of her eye at Jane, but that severe virgin was staring moodily at the ground. Her head ached and she longed for bed. Mr. Moulton, doing his best to be interested and stifle his yawns, was glancing in every direction but his immediate right, and consequently no one but his pretty daughter, and finally Catalina, noticed the handsome young Spaniard who had established communication with the blue eyes of the north. Finally the youth whispered something in which only the word adorado was intelligible to Lydia, who clung to her father's arm with a charming scowl. "Don't be frightened," whispered Catalina. "They don't mean anything, not like Frenchmen." Not only was the crowd so great that many a flirtation passed unnoticed, but heretofore Catalina had not observed that the cavalier was companioned. When he whispered to Lydia, however, she saw a man beside him frown and take his arm as if to draw him away. But when she reassured the coquette, this man turned suddenly, his brows still knit but relaxing with a flash of amusement. Then Catalina took note of him, and saw that he was not a Spaniard, although nearly as dark as Lydia's conquest. He was an Englishman, she made sure by his expression, so subtly different from that of the American. He might have been an officer from his carriage, and he was extremely thin, and walked slowly, rather than sauntered, as if the effort were distasteful or painful. His thin, well-bred face looked as if it recently might have been emaciated, but its pervading expression was humorous indifference, and his eyes had almost danced as they met hers. He did not look at her a second time, evidently seeing no profit in the idle flirtations that delighted his neighbours, and Catalina, a trifle piqued, watched him covertly, and decided that he was a nobleman, had been in the Boer War, was doubtless covered with scars and medals. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of the Travelling Thirds by Gertrude Atherton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Chapter 5. He did not haunt her dreams, however, and she had quite forgotten him as she watched the sunrise next morning from the long ridge of the Montjuich. Her cabman was refreshing himself elsewhere, and she had given herself up to one of the keenest delights known to the imaginative and ungregarious mind, the solitary contemplation of nature. She watched the great dusky plains and the jagged whiteness of Montsini's lofty crest turn yellow. Spain is one of those rare, dry countries where the very air changes colour. The whole valley seemed to fill slowly with a golden mist. The snow on the great peak and on the Pyrenees beyond glittered like the fabled sands, and even the villas clinging to the steep mountain-side, the palaces in their groves of palm trees and citron, orange, and pomegranate, all seemed to move and sway as in the depths of shimmering tides. Catalina had the gift to see colour in atmosphere as apart from the radiance that falls on sky and mountain, a gift which is said to belong only to people so highly civilized as to be on the point of degeneration. Catalina, with her robust youth and brain, was well on the hither side of degeneration, but in her lonely life and dislike of humankind she had cultivated her natural appreciation of beauty until it had not only developed her perceptions to acuteness, but empowered them, when enchanted, to rise high above the ego. She stood with her head thrown back, her mouth half open as if to quaff deeply of that golden draught, fancying that just beyond her vision lay all cosmos, waiting to reveal itself, and the mystery of the eternal. When she heard herself accosted, she was bewildered for a moment, not realizing that she was actually in the world of the living. "You will ruin your eyes, Miss Shore," a calm but genial voice had said. "The scene is worth it, but—" "How dare you speak to me?" cried Catalina furiously. She advanced swiftly, willing to strike him, not in the least mollified to recognise the Englishman upon whom she had bestowed her infrequent approval the night before. His eye lit with interest and a pardonable surprise, but he continued imperturbably, "Of course I should not have been so rude as to speak to you if I hadn't happened to know Mr. Moulton rather well. I had a talk with him last night in the hotel, and he was good enough to tell me your name." "How on earth did you ever know Cousin Lyman?" She forgot her anger. "You are an Englishman, and I am sure Cousin Lyman—" She stopped awkwardly, too loyal to continue, but her eyes were large with curiosity. Where could Lyman T. Moulton have known this Englishman with his unmistakable air of that small class for whose common sins society has no punishment? "He usually knows only literary people," she continued lamely. "And you are sure I am not?" His laugh was abrupt, but as good-natured as his voice. "You are quite right. I can't even write a decent letter, but literary men often belong to good clubs, you know, and one of the most distinguished of our authors happened to bring Mr. Moulton to one of mine. He was over some years ago." "Oh, I remember." She also recalled the curious boyish pleasure which illumined Mr. Moulton's face whenever he alluded to this visit to England. It had been his one vacation from his family in 30 years. "What is your name?" demanded Catalina with an abruptness not unlike his own, but unmodified by his careless good humour. "Over." Then, as she still looked expectant, "Captain James Brassey Over, if it interests you." "Oh!" She was childishly disappointed that he was not a lord, never having consciously seen one, then was gratified at her perspicacity of the night before. "How have I disappointed you?" "Disappointed me?" Her eyes flashed again. "All men are disappointing, and are generally idiots. But I could not be disappointed in a person to whom I had never given a thought." "Oh!" he said blankly. He was not offended, but was uncertain whether she were affected or merely a badly brought-up child. Belonging to that order of men who had something better to do than to understand women, he decided to let her remark pass and await developments. "I'm rather keen on Mr. Moulton," he announced, "and have half a mind to join your party. I was going to cut across to Madrid, but he said you have made out rather a jolly trip down the coast and then into Granada." "But we are travelling third class," she stammered, with the first prompting of snobbery she had ever known. We thought it would be such an experience." "So Mr. Moulton told me. I always travel third." "You? Why?" "Poverty," he said cheerfully. Catalina was furious with herself, the more so as she had descended to the level of her cousins, whom she secretly despised as snobs. She did not know how to extricate herself from the position she had assumed, and answered lamely, "Poverty? You don't look poor." "Only my debts keep me from being a pauper." "And you don't mind travelling third?" "Mind? It's comfortable enough, as comfortable as sleeping on the ground." Catalina's face illumined. For the first time it occurred to him that she might be pretty. She forgot the awkward subject, and asked eagerly, "Were you in the Boer War?" "Yes." "All through it?" "Pretty well." "Do tell me about it. I never before met any one who had been in the Boer War, and it interested me tremendously." "There's nothing to tell but what you must have read in the papers." "I suppose that is an affectation of modesty." "Not at all. Nothing is so commonplace as war. There is nothing in it to make conversation about." "But you lost such a dreadful number of officers." "We had plenty to spare. Could have got along better with less." His cheerfulness was certainly unaffected. The two pairs of dark eyes watched each other narrowly, his keen and amused, hers with their stolid surface and slumbering fires. "But you were wounded," she said triumphantly. "Never was hit in my life." "But you have been ill." "Oh, ill, fast enough. Rheumatism." Her eyes softened. "Ah, sleeping on the damp ground." "No, drink." For a moment the sullen fire in Catalina boiled high. Then her eyes caught the sparkle in his, and she burst into a ringing peal of laughter. She laughed rarely, but when she did her whole being vibrated to the buoyancy of youth. "Well," she said gaily, "I hope you have reformed. The Moultons are temperance, rabid, And I had rheumatism once from camping out. I had to set my teeth for a week. Then I went to a sulphur spring and cured it. But I am hungry. Is there a restaurant here somewhere?" "I was about to suggest a visit to the Café Miramar. It's only a step from here." A few minutes later they sat at a little table on the terrace, and while Captain Over ordered the coffee and rolls, Catalina forgot him and stared out over the vast blue sparkle of the Mediterranean. Above, the air had drifted from gold to pink, a soft, vague pink, stealing away before the mounting sun. She had pushed back her hat and coat, and the soft collar of her blouse showed a youthful column upon which her head was proudly set. She wore no hair on her fine open brow, but the knot at the base of her neck was rich in color. Her complexion, without red to break its magnolia tint, was flawless even in that searching light. Her beautiful eyes were vacant for the moment, and her nose, while delicate, was unclassical, her cheekbones high. But it was her mouth that arrested Over's gaze as the most singular feature he had ever seen. Childishly red, it was deftly cut, and resembled—what was it, a bow? Certainly not a Cupid's bow, for that was full and pouting. Then he recalled the Indian bows in the armory at home. That was it, the bow of an Indian bent sharply in the middle, so sharply that it was really two half-bows the mouth resembled, and absolutely perfect in its drawing, in the tapering sweep of its corners. A perfect mouth is a feature one may read of for a lifetime and never see, however many mouths there be that charm and invite. Pretty mouths are abundant enough, and mouths that indicate lofty or delightful characteristics, but rarely is the mouth seen for which nature has done all that she so generously does for eyes and profile. But for Catalina she had cut a mouth so exquisite that its first effect was of something uncanny, as of an unknown race, and it further held the attention as indicating absolutely nothing of the character behind. Catalina dazedly removed her eyes from the sea and met Over's. "Stop staring at me," she said with a frown. He was about to retort that she had been made to be stared at, but it occurred to him in time that he understood her too little to invite her into the airy region of compliment. He had known girls to resent them before, and they were not in his line anyway. He merely replied, "Here comes the coffee. I promise you to give it my undivided attention." They sat silent for a few moments, keenly appreciating their little repast. Coffee always went to Catalina's head, and when she had finished she felt happy and full of good fellowship. "I like you immensely, and hope you'll come with us," she announced. "I'm rather sorry you are not a lord, though. I've never seen one." "Well, I have a cousin who is one, and if you come to England I'll show him to you. He's rather an ass, though, and you'll probably guy him." "You are not very respectful to the head of your house." "Oh, he was my fag at school. He's 2 years younger than I am." "Is he in the House of Peers?" "Good Lord, no. That is, he has his seat, of course, but I doubt if he'd recognize Westminster in a photograph. Gaiety girls are his lay. We married him young, though, and assured the succession." "Is he a typical lord?" "What's that? We have all sorts, like any other class. I might as well ask you if you were a typical American." "Well, I'm not," cried Catalina, with lightning in her eyes. "If nature had made me a type, I'd have made myself over. It makes me hate nearly everybody. But, at least, I love to be alone, and I can always get that when I want it. I've got a big ranch, 50,000 acres, and after my mother died 2 years ago I lived on it alone, never speaking to a soul but my men of business and the servants. That's my idea of bliss, and the moment I strike the American shore I'm going back." He looked at her with increasing interest, a girl of silences who loved nature and hated man. But he merely said with a quick smile, "You are a very grand young person indeed. Somerton, my cousin, has only 30,000 acres. Of course, he's beastly poor, has so much to keep up. I suppose a ranch of that size is pure luxury, and blossoms like the rose." "Much you know about it. I often have all I can do to make both ends meet. Droughts kill off my cattle and sheep, and dry up everything that grows. My Mexicans and Indians are an idle, worthless lot, but sentiment prevents me from turning them off. Their grandparents worked on the ranch. It makes me independent, of course, but I really am what is called land poor. I'm thinking of dividing a part of it into farms and selling them, and also of selling some property I have on Santa Catalina, which has become fashionable. Then I shall be quite rich. Mother could get work out of anybody, but I'm not nearly so energetic, and they know it. But I am so happy when I am there, and need so little money for myself, that I haven't thought about it heretofore. Being over here has taught me the value of money, and I want to come back to Europe before long. Then I'll come alone and stay several years. There is so much to learn, and I find I know next to nothing. Well, let us go. As long as I am with the Moultons I suppose I must consider them, and they probably think I have been kidnapped. Who was that youth you were walking with last night?" "The Marquis Zuñiga. I met him at the club and we strolled out together. I introduced him to Mr. Moulton, and he will call this afternoon. He is quite bowled over by your golden-haired cousin. I suppose we can drive back together. It would look rather absurd, wouldn't it, going down in a procession of two?" End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of The Travelling Thirds by Gertrude Atherton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Chapter 6. They were to have remained in Barcelona a week, but Mr. Moulton, alarmed at the impassioned devotion of Zuñiga to Lydia, decided to leave on the morning of the 4th day. "That will be just 6 hours before Zuñiga is up, so you need not worry about giving him the slip," said Captain Over, who thought that Lydia would be well out of the young Spaniard's way. "If Miss Shore will join me in the morning, we can do the shopping for the family. She speaks Spanish, and I have done this sort of thing before." Mr. Moulton, who looked upon Over as his personal conquest, and, despite his good looks, never thought of him in the light of a marrying man, gave his message to Catalina, and pattered down the hall to break the news to his family. He was nervous but determined. Mrs. Moulton had seen all of Barcelona that was necessary for retrospect and conversation. Jane immediately began to pack her portmanteau. Lydia shot him a glance of reproach, flushed, and turned away. "I won't have any decadent Spaniards philandering round my daughters," said Mr. Moulton, firmly. "If you were going to marry a Spaniard, I had rather it were a peasant, for they, at least, are the hope of the country. This young Zuñiga hasn't an idea in his head beyond flirting and horse-racing. He has no education and no principles." "I've talked with him more than you have," said Lydia with spirit, "and I think him lovely." "Lovely! What a term to apply to any man, let alone a dissipated Spaniard! Have I not begged you, my love, to choose your adjectives, one of the first principles of style?" "I don't write," retorted Lydia, who was in a very naughty mood. "I have no use for style." "I should never be surprised to see your name in our best magazines," said Mr. Moulton, with his infinite tact. "Make this young man the hero of a story, if you like. A clever Englishwoman I met yesterday, and who has lived in Spain for many years, told me that the Spanish youth is the brightest in the world, but that when he reaches the age of 14 his brain closes up like the shell of an oyster and never opens again. The reason is that at that age he takes to immoderate smoking and various other forms of dissipation, the brain from that time on receiving neither nourishment nor encouragement. I intend to write an essay on the subject. It is most interesting. And I thought out a splendid phrase this afternoon. I'll write it down this moment before I forget it." He whipped out his notebook. "The only hope for Spain lies in the abolishment of bullfights, beggars, and churches. First of all there must be a revolution in which the most worthless aristocracy in Europe will disappear for ever. I would not have them beheaded, but driven out. Now pack before you go to bed, my love, for we must be up bright and early. We have not seen the cathedral. Shall I help you?" Jane had finished. Lydia sulkily declined his assistance. He kissed them both and went off to his nightly jottings and to pack the conjugal portmanteau. Lydia continued to brush out her golden locks and to frown at her mirror. She longed for sympathy and a confidant, but knew that Jane would agree with her father, and recalled that Catalina had barely taken note of Zuñiga's existence. "But if he has any sand," she informed herself, "he will follow me up, and I'll marry whom I please. So there!" The next morning, having seen the rest of the party off to the cathedral, Catalina and Captain Over started down the Rambla Centro in high good humour. They shared the exhilaration of moving on, and enjoyed the novelty of the new housekeeping. They packed a hamper with cold ham and roast chicken, cake, and 2 loaves of bread. Then Catalina bought recklessly in the confectioner's, and Captain Over visited a coffee shop. When they had filled the front seat of their cab, Catalina, after a half hour of sharp bargaining, bought a white lace mantilla and a fine old fan. "These are 2 of the things I came to Spain for," she announced to the bewildered Englishman, who had shopped with women before, but never with a woman who was definite, concentrated, driving hard in a straight line. As they went out with the precious bundle, he ventured his first remark. "I had an idea you were indifferent to dress." "I am and I am not. I had rather be comfortable most of the time, and I hate being stared at, but when I dress, I dress. I may never wear this mantilla, but it is a thing of beauty to possess and look at." "I hope you will wear it, and here in Spain. Are you part Spanish, by the way?" "No, Indian." "Indian?" He looked at her with renewed interest. "Do you mind?" "No, I don't. It's a good excuse for a whole lot of things." "Ah, I see. Well, it certainly makes you different from other people. You like that, and you may believe it." Lydia was profoundly thankful to leave Barcelona while her Marquis still slumbered. She was too young and curious not to be glad to travel on any terms, but to say farewell in a third–class carriage to a member of an ancient aristocracy was quite another matter. She accounted for Captain Over's willingness to travel humbly by the supposition that he was in love with Catalina, and did not believe for a moment that it was his habit. But Captain Over was not in love with Catalina. He was still half an invalid, and constitutionally indolent, as are most men who are immediately attractive to women. She interested and amused him, was a good comrade when in a good humour, and as full of pluck and resource as a boy. He liked all the family, including Jane, who was charmed with him, and enjoyed Mr. Moulton's many good stories. It was a pleasant party, and he was glad to join it, but if he had been summoned hastily back to England, or been sure that when the journey was over he should never see these agreeable companions again, he would have accepted the decree with the philosophy of one who had met many delightful people in many country houses, and sat by many delightful women at many London dinners, whose very names he might forget before he saw them again. It was a part of his charm that he appeared to live so wholly in the present, without retrospect or anticipation, and Catalina concluded it was the result of being a soldier, whose time was not his own, and who was ready and willing to accept the end of all things at any moment. The cool, open car in which they moved out of Barcelona had an aisle down the middle, and was new and highly varnished. Even Jane condescended to remark that in hot weather, in a dusty country, such accommodations were preferable to upholstered seats, which, doubtless, were not brushed once a month. Then she retired to her pater, and the rest of the party hung out of the windows and gazed at the tremendous ridge of Montserrat, cutting the blue sky like 1,000 twisted fingers petrified in their death–throes. It is the most jagged mass of rock in Europe. Nature would seem to have spat it out through gnashing teeth, and surely no spot more terrifying, even to the gods, could have been selected for the safe–keeping of the Holy Grail. Then once more the train ambled through vineyards and silver olive–groves, past old brown castles on their rocky heights, glimpses of Roman roads and ruins, the innumerable tunnels making the brown plains more dazzling, the sea in glimpses like a chain of peacock's feathers. To–day, for the greater part of the trip, their companions were a large party of washing–women, brawny, with shining pleasant faces. They wore blue cotton frocks and white handkerchiefs pinned about their slippery heads. On the capacious lap of each was a basket of white clothes. They gossiped volubly, and paid no attention to the Americans, who, indeed, in a short time, were so dusty that the varnish of civilization was obliterated. They were a gay party. As the day's trip was to be short, Mrs. Moulton concluded not to feel tired, and while they were in the tunnels, Captain Over made her a cup of tea under the seat, regardless of the Guardia Civile, who were honouring the carriage with their presence. These personages looked very sturdy and self–confident in their smart uniforms, and quite capable of handling the always possible bandit. Catalina audibly invoked him. She was possessed by that exhilaration which a woman feels when in the companionship of a new and interesting man, with whom she is not in love. The great passion induces an illogical depression of spirits, melancholy forebodings, and extremes of sentimentalism, which are the death of high spirits and humour. Catalina had some inkling of this, having experienced one or two brief and silent attacks of misplaced affection, and rejoiced in the spontaneous and mutual friendship. Outwardly she looked as solemn as usual, but perhaps even hidden sunshine may warm, for on no day since they left Lyons had the party been so independent of material ills. Even Lydia came forth from the sulky aloofness of the morning, and Jane laid Pater to rest, when, after the excellent luncheon, Catalina produced a large box of bonbons. By this time there was no one in the car but the Guardia Civile and a young peasant, a brawny, handsome Catalan, who might have been the village blacksmith, and a possible leader in the anarchy of his province. He had the haughty, independent manner of his class, and although his eye was fiery and reckless, the lower part of his face symbolized power and self–control. Lydia, having carefully washed the dust from her face, in a spirit of mischief, and breathless in her first open act of mutiny, left her seat abruptly, and offered the box of sweets first to the military escort, who arose and declined with a profound bow, then to the young peasant. She had stood before the guards with downcast eyes, but when the peasant turned to her, she deliberately lifted her long brown eyelashes, and the blue shallows sparkling with coquetry met a wild and eager flash never encountered before. A blue silk handkerchief was knotted loosely about her dishevelled golden head, she wore a blue soft cotton blouse, and her cheeks were pink. Dainty and sweet and gracious, what wonder that she dazzled the rustic accustomed to maidens as swarthy as himself. "Madre de Dios!" he muttered. "A dulce, señor?" said Lydia, with the charming hesitation of the imperfect linguist. Then the peasant rose, and with the grace and courtesy of a grandee, possessed himself of a bonbon, but he did not know, perhaps, that it was intended to go the road of black bread and garlic, for he fumbled in the pocket of his blouse, brought forth an envelope, rolled up the sweetmeat, and tenderly secreted it. Lydia gave him a radiant smile, shook her head, and still held out the box. "Eat one," she said, and as the man only stared at her with deepening colour, she put one of the bonbons into her own mouth, and motioned to him to follow suit. This time he obeyed her, and for the moment they had the appearance, and perhaps the sensation, of breaking bread together. "Dios de mi alma!" muttered the man, and then Lydia bowed to him gravely and turned slowly, reluctantly, and rejoined her panting family. Mrs. Moulton's face was scarlet. She was sitting upright, the air–cushions were in a heap on the floor. Mr. Moulton's bland visage expressed solemn indignation, an expression which he had the ability to infuse into the review of a book prudence warned him to condemn. "Lydia Moulton!" exclaimed her mother. "I am grieved and ashamed," said her father. "Why?" asked Lydia, flippantly. "It is the custom in Spain to share with your travelling companions, and last night you said you had rather I married a Spanish peasant than a Spanish gentleman." "I am ashamed of you," repeated Mr. Moulton, with dignity. "Are you looking for a husband, may I ask? If so, we will go direct to Gibraltar, and take the first steamer for America." Lydia coloured, but she was still in a naughty mood, and encouraged by a sympathetic flash from Catalina, she retorted, "No, I don't want to marry, but I do want to be able to look at a man unchaperoned by the entire family. I haven't had the liberty of a convent girl since I arrived in Europe. I feel like running off with the first man that finds a chance to propose to me." Mrs. Moulton, whose complexion during this outburst had faded to its normal grey tones, the little lines of cultivated worries and invalidism quivering on the surface, turned her pale gaze upon Catalina. She stared mutely, but volumes rolled into the serene, contemptuous orbs 2 seats away. Mr. Moulton, in his way, was a rapid thinker. "My dear," he said gently to the revolutionist, If we have surrounded you, it has not been from distrust, but because you are far too pretty to be alone among foreigners for a moment. At home, as you know, you often receive your young friends alone. I am sure that when you think the matter over, you will regret your lapse from dignity, particularly as you have no doubt disturbed that poor young man's peace of mind." Lydia seldom rebelled, but she had learned that when her father became diplomatic she might as well smite upon a stone. So she refrained from further sarcasm, and retreating to a seat behind the others, stared sullenly out of the window. She was not unashamed of herself, but longed nevertheless to meet again the fiery gaze of the Catalan, the anarchist she called him. It sounded far better than peasant. Zuñiga dwindled out of her memory as the poor artificial thing he no doubt was. At last she had seen a blaze of admiration in the eyes of a real man. She was not wise enough to know that it was nothing in her meagre little personality that had roused the lightnings in a manly bosom, merely a type of prettiness made unconventional by the setting and the man. But the impression was made, and had she dared she would have sent an occasional demure glance towards the young peasant behind her. As it was, she adjusted her charming profile for his delectation. They entered the long tunnel which the train traverses before skirting the bluffs of Tarragona. Spain does not light its railway carriages before dark. Lydia had thrown her arm along the seat. Suddenly she became aware that someone, as lithe and noiseless as a cat, had entered the seat behind her. She was smitten with sudden terror, and held her breath. A second later a pair of young and ardent lips passed as lightly as a passing flame along her rigid hand. "Dueno adorado!" The voice was almost at her ear. Then she knew that the seat was empty again. Her first impulse had been to cry out. She was terrified and furious. But she had a quick vision of a mêlée of knives and pistols, the Guardia Civile and peasant, reinforcements from the next car, and the death of all her party. It was the imaginative feat of her life, and as the train ran out of the tunnel she congratulated herself warmly, and put on her hat as indifferently as Jane, who had never known the kiss of a man. She swept past her admirer with her head high and her lids, with their curling lashes, low. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of the Travelling Thirds by Gertrude Atherton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Chapter 7. "Ah!" exclaimed Captain Over, "this is Spain. Who is going to sit with me in front?" Catalina made no reply, but she ran swiftly to the big canvas-covered diligence, climbed over the high wheel before Over could follow to assist her, and seated herself beside the driver with the most ingratiating manner that any of her party had seen her assume. Over placed himself beside her, the others took possession of the rear, the driver cracked his whip, and the 6 mules, jingling with 100 bells, leaped down the dusty road toward the steep and rocky heights where Tarragona has defied the nations of the earth. Then it was that Over laughed softly, and the innocent Moultons learned what depths of iniquity may lie at the base of a ranch girl's blandishments. As they reached the foot of the bluff, the delighted youth who was answerable to Heaven for his precious freight abandoned the reins. Catalina gathered them in one hand, half rose from her seat, and with a great flourish cracked the long whip, not once, but thrice, delivering herself of sharp peremptory cries in Spanish. The mules needed no further encouragement. They tore up the steep and winding road, whisked round curves, strained every muscle to show what a Spanish mule could do. They even shook their heads and tossed them in the air that their bells might jingle the louder. Mrs. Moulton and Jane screamed, clinging to each other, the portmanteaus bounced to the floor, and Mr. Moulton would have grasped Catalina's arm, but Over intercepted and reassured him. And, indeed, there were few better whips than Catalina in a state notorious for a century of reckless and brilliant driving. She drove like a cowboy, not like an Englishwoman, Over commented, but he felt the exhilaration of it, even when the unwieldy diligence bounded from side to side in the narrow road, and the dust enveloped them. In a moment he shifted his eyes to her face. Her white teeth were gleaming through the half–open bow of her mouth, tense but smiling, and her splendid eyes were flashing, not only with the pleasure of the born horsewoman, but with a wicked delight in the consternation behind her. She looked, despite the mules and the dusty old diligence, like a goddess in a chariot of victory, and Over, who rarely imagined, half expected to see a fire whirling in the clouds of dust about the wheels. As they reached the top of the bluff the driver indicated the way, and they flew down the Rambla San Carlos, past the astounded soldiers lounging in front of the barracks, and stopped with a grand flourish in front of the hotel. Catalina turned to Over, her lips still parted, her eyes glittering. "That is the first time I have been really happy since I left home," she announced, ignoring her precipitately descending relatives. "I feel young again, and I've felt as old as the hills ever since I've been in Europe. I'll like you forever because you approve of me, and I haven't seen that expression on anybody's face for months." "Oh, I approve of you," said the Englishman, laughing. They descended, and she challenged him to race her to the parapet that they might limber themselves. He accepted, and, in spite of her undepleted youth, he managed to beat her by means of a superior length of limb. The victory filled him with a quite unreasoning sense of exultation, and as they hung over the parapet and looked out upon the liquid turquoise of the sea, sparkling under a cloudless sky, its little white sailboats dancing along with the pure joy of motion, he felt younger and happier than he had since his cricket days. "I think we had better not go to the hotel for a time," he suggested. "I am afraid that Mr. and Mrs. Moulton are in a bit of a wax. Perhaps after they have rested and freshened up they will forgive you, and meanwhile we can explore." So they wandered off to the old town until they stood at the foot of a flight of ancient stone steps, wider than 3 streets, that led up to the plaza before the cathedral. Crouching in the shallow corners of the stair were black–robed old crones who looked as if they might have begged of Cæsar. Passing up and down, or in and out of the narrow streets, to right and left, were young women of languid and insolent carriage, in bright cotton frocks and yellow kerchiefs about their heads, young men in small clothes and wide hats, loafing along as if all time were in their little day, and troops and swarms of children. These attached themselves to the strangers, encouraged by the caressing Spanish words of the girl, followed them through the cathedral and out into a side street, chattering like magpies. "You look like a comet with a long tail," said Over. "I'll scatter them with a few coppers." He paused as she turned her head over her shoulder and regarded him with a wondering reproach. For the moment her large brown eyes looked bovine. "Do you want these little demons to follow us all over the place?" he asked curiously. "Why not? Tarragona is theirs," said Over lightly. "They would annoy most women." He hoped to provoke her to further revelation, but she made no reply, and they rambled with occasional speech through the ancient narrow streets, followed by their noisy retinue, the little Murillo faces sparkling with curiosity and foresight of illimitable wealth in coppers. But even Catalina forgot them at times, as she and her companion stopped to decipher the Roman inscription on the foundation blocks of many of the houses. Although the houses themselves may have been younger than the huge blocks with their legends of the Scipios and the Cæsars, they were old enough, and the steep and winding streets, with the women hanging out of the high windows and sitting before the doors, all bits of colour against the mellow stone, were no doubt much the same in effect as when Augustus and his hosts marched by with eagles aloft. Catalina, who had the historic sense highly developed, and had found her happiness in the past, infected Over with her enthusiasm, and he followed her without protest to the outskirts of the town, and looked down over the great valley beneath the heights of Tarragona, then up past the cyclopean walls, those stupendous unhewn blocks of masonry which still, for a sweep of 2 miles or more, surround the old town. "What a place to hide from the world!" said Catalina. They had turned into a little street just within the wall, and seated themselves on an odd block to rest, their exhausted retinue camping all the way along the line. Opposite them was a high and narrow house, its upper balcony full of flowers, and an arcade behind suggesting the dim quiet of patio with its palms and fountain, its shadows haunted with incommunicable memories of an ancient past. The new town we drove through with its fine houses is too commonplace, but any one of these eyries, what a nest! I could live quite happy up there, couldn't you?" "For a time." He was too frankly modern to yield unconditionally. "But I must confess I can't think what artists are about." When they reached the plaza, Catalina turned to the children and solemnly thanked them for the great pleasure and service they had rendered two belated strangers. They accepted the tribute in perfect good faith, and then scrambled for the coppers. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8 of The Travelling Thirds by Gertrude Atherton. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Chapter 8. Over and Catalina walked hastily to the hotel. They had but half an hour in which to make themselves presentable for dinner. Preparation for this function, however, was not elaborate. A tub and a change of shirt and blouse was all that could be expected of weary tourists travelling with one portmanteau each. Their trunks were not to leave the stations until they reached Granada. Catalina invariably appeared in her hat, ready to go out again the moment the meal was over if she could induce Mr. Moulton to take her. To-night the others sat down to their excellent repast in the cool dining-room without her. Mrs. Moulton and Jane were disposed to treat Over with hauteur, but thawed after the soup and fish. Mr. Moulton had long since recovered his serenity, and expressed regret that he had not accompanied the more enterprising members of the party. Only Lydia, who had put on her prettiest blouse and fluffed her hair anew, was interested in neither dinner nor Tarragona. "Off your feed?" Over was asking sympathetically, when Mrs. Moulton, who was helping herself to the roast, dropped the fork on her plate. The others followed the direction of her astonished eyes and beheld Catalina, but not the Catalina of their habit. Hers was the largest of the portmanteaus, and it was evident that she had excavated it at last. Gone were the stiff, short skirt and ill-fitting blouse, the drooping hat and shapeless coat. She wore a girlish gown of white nun's veiling, made with a masterly simplicity that revealed her figure in all its long grace, its gentle curves, and supple power of endurance. Only the round throat and forearms were revealed, but the lace about them and the calm stateliness of her carriage produced the impression of full dress. Her mass of waving chestnut hair, with a sheen of gold like a web on its surface, was parted and brushed back from her oval face into a heavy knot at the base of the head. Around her throat she wore a string of pearls, and falling from her shoulders a crimson scarf. She walked down the long room with a perfect simulation of unconsciousness, except for the lofty carriage of her head, which concealed much inward trepidation. Her broad brow was as bland as a child, and her eyes wore what an admirer had once called her wondering look. Never had her remarkable mouth looked so like a bow, the bow of her Indian ancestors. A beauty she was at last, fulfilling the uneasy prediction of her relatives. The few other people in the dining-room stared, and Captain Over, who had risen, stared at her hard. "Ripping, ripping," he thought. Then, with a shock of personal pride, "She no longer looks like a cowboy. She might be on her way to court." It was characteristic of Catalina that she did not even sink into her chair with one of those airy remarks with which woman demonstrates her ease in unusual circumstances. She made no remark whatever, but helped herself to the roast and fell to with a hearty appetite. Neither did she send a flash of coquetry to Captain Over, and he, with an odd sense that in her incongruity and the hostility aroused in two of the party, she stood in need of a protector, began talking much faster than was his wont, and even condescended to tell Mr. Moulton an anecdote of the late campaign. Having gone so far, he hardly could retreat, and indeed his reluctance seemed finally to be overcome. Very soon the company had forgotten Catalina, and Catalina came forth from herself and hung upon his words. Given her own way, she would have been a man and a soldier, and like all normal women she exalted heroism to the head of the manly virtues. Over told no stories wherein he was the hero, but unwittingly he unrolled a panorama of infinite possibilities for the brave race of whose best he was a type. At all events he made himself extremely interesting, and when he was finally left to Mr. Moulton and cigars, Catalina walked blindly out of the front door of the hotel, re-invoking the pictures that had stimulated her imagination. She was recalled by the pressure of a small but bony hand on her bare arm. She turned to meet the cold blue gaze of Mrs. Moulton. That gentlewoman was very erect and very formal. "You cannot go out alone," she said, with disgust in her voice. "I am surprised to be forced to remind you that this is not California. It would be impossible in your travelling costume, but dressed as for an evening's entertainment in a private house you would be insulted at once. As long as you travel with us I must insist that you give as little trouble as possible." If she hoped for war, feeling herself for once secure, she was disappointed. Catalina merely shrugged her shoulders and, re-entering the hall, ascended the stair. She recalled that her room opened upon a balcony, which would answer her purpose. The balcony hung above a garden overflowing with flowers, surrounded on three sides by the hotel and its low outbuildings, and secluded from the sloping street by a high wall. She paced up and down, watching the servants under the veranda washing their dishes. They all wore a bit of the bright color beloved of the Iberian, and they made a great deal of noise. Suddenly Lydia took possession of her arm and related the adventure of the afternoon. "Is it not dreadful?" she concluded. "A peasant! But to save my life I cannot be as furious as I should, nor help thinking of it. I feel like one of those princesses in the fairy tales beloved of the poor but wonderful youth." "It is highly romantic," replied Catalina, dryly. "The setting was not all that it might have been, and I have seen too many picturesque vaqueros all my life to be deeply impressed by a handsome peasant in a blouse, but I suppose any romance is better than none in this old world." She felt vaguely alarmed, and half a generation older than this silly little cousin whose suburban experience made her peculiarly susceptible to any semblance of romance in Europe. But as Lydia, repelled in her girlish confidence, drew stiffly away from her, Catalina relented with a gush of feminine sympathy. "I really mean that a bit of romance like that makes life more endurable," she asserted. "And you may be sure that your Marquis would not have been so delicate. I wonder who he is. He certainly is a personage in his way. Of course, you'll never see him again, but it will be something to think about when you are married to an author and correcting his typewritten manuscripts." Lydia, mollified, laughed merrily. "I'm never going to marry any old author. Let the recording angel take note of that. I'm sick of mutual admiration societies and all the rest of it. If I can't do any better, I'll manage to marry some enterprising young business man and help him to grow rich." Catalina, who had had her own way all her life, nevertheless appreciated the colorless shallows in which her cousin had splashed of late in the vain attempt to reach the shore, and replied sympathetically: "Come back to California when I go, and live on my ranch for a while. Out of doors is what you want. A far–away horizon is as good for the soul as for the eyes, and you'll get enough of the picturesque and all the liberty you can carry." She paused abruptly, and Lydia caught her breath. In the street below was the sound of a guitar, then of a man's impassioned voice. The girl stole to the edge of the balcony and looked over. There was no moon, and the vines were close. The street was thick with shadows, but they could see the lithe, active figure of a man, clad in velvet jacket and small–clothes. His head was flung back, and his quick, rich notes seemed to leap to the balcony above. Catalina had forgotten that her candles still burned. Their rays fell directly on the girls. The man saw them, and his voice burst forth in such peremptory volume, ringing against the walls of the narrow street, that heads began to appear at many windows. "It is that peasant we saw on the train to–day," said Over's amused voice behind the girls. "He was in the café a moment ago, and is got up in full peasant finery. You made a conquest, Miss Lydia." Catalina felt her companion give an ecstatic shiver, but omitted to pull her back as she leaned recklessly over the rail. Her own spirit seemed to swirl in that glorious tide. She threw back her head, staring at the black velvet skies of Spain with their golden music, then turned slowly and regarded the old white walls and gardens about her, the palms and the riot of flowers and vine, invoking the image of Caesar himself prowling in the night to the lattice of inviting loveliness in a mantilla. She wished she had draped her own about her head, and wondered if Over shared her vision. But he was merely marvelling at her beauty and wondering if he should ever get as far as California. He would like to see her in that patio she had described to him, with its old mission fountain, its gigantic date palms through whose bending branches the sun never penetrated, the big-leaved banana tree heavy with yellow fruit, the scarlet hammock, the mountains rising just behind the old house. She had described it to him only that afternoon, and he had received a vivid impression of it all, and of the deep verandas and the cool, austere rooms within. It had struck him as a delightful retreat after the strife of the world, and he wondered if under that eternally blue sky, in that southern land of warmth and colour, where the very air caressed, he could not forget even the broad domain of his ancestors, a domain that would never be his, but where he was always a welcome guest. She had told him that her estate, her ranch, went right down to the sea. It was, in fact, a wide valley, closed with the Pacific at one end and a range of mountains immediately behind the house. It had seemed to him the ideal existence as she described it, a perfect balance of the intellectual and the outdoor life, of boundless freedom and unvarying health, and all in an atmosphere of perfect peace. He had envied her at the moment, but had philosophically concluded that in the long run a man's club most nearly filled the bill. He fancied, however, that he should correspond with her, and one of these days pay her a visit. "Best remember that this is the land of passion, not of idle flirtation, Miss Lydia," he said, warningly, as the music ceased for a moment. "What is play to you might be death to that Johnny down there." For answer, Lydia plucked a rose and dropped it into a lithe brown hand that shot up to meet it. Chapter 9 of the Travelling Thirds by Gertrude Atherton. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. Catalina threw on her dressing-gown and leaned far out of her window. The very air felt as if it had been drenched by the golden shower of the morning sun, and so clear it was, it glittered like the sea. Across the narrow way was a stately white house, doubtless the palace of a rich man, and behind it, high above the street, was a beautiful garden, at whose very end, in an angle of the stone wall, stood a palm-tree. Beyond that palm-tree, so delicate and graceful in its peculiar stiffness, was a glimpse of blue water. Far below was a cross–street, in which no one moved as yet, and beside her were the balcony and garden of the hotel and the vines hanging over the wall. Catalina sang, in the pure joy of being alive, a snatch of one of the Spanish songs still to be heard in Southern California. "Buenos dias, señorita," broke in a low and cautious voice, and Catalina, turning with a start and frown, saw that Captain Over was looking round the corner of the balcony. "If you will come out here," he continued, "I will make you a cup of coffee, and then we can go for a walk." Catalina nodded amiably, and, hastily dressing herself, opened her long window and joined him. He had brought his travelling-lamp and coffee-pot, and the water was simmering. With the exception of a man who was cleaning harness in the court below, they seemed to be the only persons awake. The air was heavy laden with sweet scents, and the garden in the fresh morning light was a riot of colour. The Mediterranean was murmuring seductively to the shore. "This is heaven," sighed Catalina. Why can't one always be free from care like this? The Moultons, to be exact. Let's you and I and Lydia run away from the rest." "When I run away with a woman, I shall not take a chaperon," said Over, coolly. Catalina could assume the blankness of a mask, but upon repartee she never ventured. "Am I not to do any of the work?" she asked. "I am sick of being waited on. At home I often make my own breakfast before my lazy Mexicans are up, and saddle my horse. I do a great deal of work on the ranch, first and last, for I believe in work. And I didn't get the idea from Tolstoy, either. I don't like Tolstoy," she added defiantly. "He's one of those gigantic fakes the world always believes in." "Well, I've never read a line of Tolstoy," admitted Captain Over, who was carefully revolving his coffee machine, "so I can't argue with you. But work! This is all the work I want." "Don't you love work?" "I don't." "But you do work." "At what?" "Oh, in the army and all that." "My orderly does the work." "You are so provoking." "There is all sorts of work you must do yourself." "Well, why do you remind me of anything so painful, when I am doing my best to forget it? You are not an altruist or a socialist, are you?" "I'm not anything that some one else has invented. I believe in work because idleness horrifies me. Some primal instinct in me wars against it. The civilization that permits idleness in the rich and in those with just enough to relieve them from work, with none of the responsibilities and diversions of great fortunes, is no civilization at all to my mind. Of course I believe in progress, but I believe in hanging on to the conditions which first made progress possible, and when I saw those carriage loads of ridiculous women in finery in Paris I wanted to go home and till the soil and restore the balance. How good that coffee smells." He poured her out a steaming cup. He had raided the kitchen for cream and bread, and he carried sugar with him. No orderly had ever made better coffee. "What women?" he asked, smiling into her still angry eyes. They were seated at a little table close to the railing, and the vines hung down in her hair. Her theories might be crude and somewhat vague, but at least she thought for herself. She described the morning in the Rue de Rivoli and the procession of American butterflies. "What can you expect in a new republic of sudden fortunes?" he asked. "Some one must spend the money, and the men haven't time." "Then are your women something besides nerves and clothes, your leisure women?" "I don't wish to be rude, but they are. I am, of course, only comparing them with your idle class. I have had no chance to meet any other until now, but I have met scores of rich American women and girls in London and at country houses, and I've come to the conclusion that what is the matter with them, aside from lack of traditions, is that their men leave them nothing to do but spend money and amuse themselves. With us, rich women and poor are helpmeets, and what saves our fast set from being as empty-headed as yours is that they have grown up among men of affairs, have heard the great questions discussed all their lives. Then, of course, they are far better educated, and often extremely clever, something more than bright and amusing. Many of them are pretty hard cases, I'm not denying that, but few are silly. They have not had the chance to be, and that is where ancestors come in too, serious ancestors. Personally, I have never been sensible to the famous charm of the American woman, and although there are exceptions, naturally, I am only generalizing, they strike me in the mass as being shallow, selfish, egotistical, nervous. I suppose the fundamental trouble is that they have so much that an impossible ideal of happiness is the result, and they are restless and dissatisfied because they can't get it. Possibly in another generation or two they may develop the sort of brain that makes the women of the old world well balanced and philosophical." "Weren't you ever tempted to marry an heiress?" "I never saw one that would look at me, so I've been spared one temptation at least." Catalina had finished her coffee. She leaned her chin on her hands and gazed at him reflectively. "I should think you could get one," she said quite impersonally. "If you weren't such a practical soul, you'd be almost romantic looking. And you're quite the ideal soldier.
besides being a guardsman and well born. I think if you came to Santa Barbara I could find you a rich girl. Quantities come there for the winter, and they are always delighted to be asked to a ranch." "All women are matchmakers," he said testily. "A poor fellow I left out in South Africa just got off one epigram in his life. There are two kinds of women, living women and dead women. I believe he was right. Shall we go and see if they will let us into the Archbishop's palace?" Chapter 10 of the Travelling Thirds by Gertrude Atherton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10 "Quien quiere agua? Quien quiere agua?" The shrill cries of the water-carriers smote upon grateful ears as the dusty, sun-baked train paused at Fuente, a little station on the zigzag between Valencia and Albacete. They were young, misshapen girls, the hip that supported the gourd at least 3 inches higher than the other, with a corresponding elevation of shoulder. All along the train hands were waving encouragingly, accompanied by cries of "Aquí! Aquí!" and the glasses were rapidly filled and emptied. But few ran over to the cantina, where the wine of the country was sold, and the amount of water that is dispensed at every station in Spain should encourage those whose war-cry is temperance, and who are prone to believe that the southern races are lost. But water is precious in Spain, and must be paid for. At every station old women are waiting with buckets to catch the discharge from the engine, not, it is to be hoped, for traffic. Even the Moultons, who had exhausted Captain Over's aluminium bottle, and had prejudices against uncertified water, passed out their own cups and drank thirstily. No one was in his best temper. Valencia is a dirty, noisy, ill-mannered city, and after 2 sleepless nights they had been forced to rise early or remain another day. Moreover, the handsome peasant had followed them with a melodious persistence that was causing Mr. Moulton serious uneasiness. It was impossible to appeal to the Guardia Civil, for the man did nothing that was not within his rights. For the matter of that, the stranger in Spain is practically without rights. The man, his name, it was now known, was Jesus Maria, a name common enough in a land without humour, never even offered them the usual courtesies of travel. Nevertheless, he managed to make his presence felt in 100 ways independently of his voice and guitar, as well as the subtle intimation that for the stern frown on Mr. Moulton's brow he cared nothing. "I don't wish any trouble, of course," Mr. Moulton had said to Over that morning, "but I am seriously considering the plan of continuing the journey to Granada in a first-class carriage. Lydia has already begun to suffer from the annoyance, and it is abominable that a refined, carefully brought-up girl should be subjected to such an experience. The Marquis was bad enough, but this! Even when her back is to him, I am sure she feels his rude stare. I can assure you, Over, a pretty daughter is a great responsibility, but although I have had to dispose, diplomatically of course, of several undesirable suitors, I never even anticipated anything like this. It is preposterous." "The first-class idea is not bad. It would emphasize the difference between them. It is rather a puzzle to him, I fancy—he is a Spaniard, remember— that we travel in his own way, and yet regard him from a superior plane." Captain Over, as he stood with Catalina at a booth on the platform, buying substantial tortillas made of eggs, meat, and potatoes, repeated the conversation. "He thinks they have never communicated in any way," he added. "What is the best thing to do? I don't fancy telling tales, but it seems to me Mr. Moulton should be warned." "Oh, Lydia can take care of herself," said Catalina, carelessly. "She is a little flirt and quite intoxicated with what she calls an intrigue. It is the first time she has ever done any thinking for herself. You can see what Cousin Lyman is. He'd feed us if we'd let him. If we were Moultons, we'd be taking a little fling ourselves. Here she comes." Lydia found a place beside them in the crowd that was clamoring for the old woman's hot tortillas. "Mother says there is not enough bread," she said. "Jane is afraid of the beggars, and father has disappeared, or I suppose I should not have got this far alone. Talk about the freedom of the American girl! I'd like to write a book to tell the world how many different kinds of Americans there are." "You can't deny that you are a spoiled child, though," said Over, banteringly, and then he scowled. The young peasant had joined the group and was quietly demanding a tortilla. He no longer wore his peasant blouse, but the gala costume he had bought or borrowed in Tarragona. He was a superb figure of a man, and every woman on the platform stared at him. He looked haughtily aloof, even from Lydia, but Over saw her hand seek her little waist-bag, and suspected that a note passed. "He certainly is a man," he said to Catalina as they walked back to the train. "Looks more of a gentleman, for that matter, than a good many we dine with. Still, it can't go on, so set your wits to work, and we'll get rid of him between us." But for Jesus Maria the afternoon would have been delightful. They were ascending, and the air was cooler. The great plain of La Mancha was studded with windmills, and its horizon gave up the welcome and lofty ridges of the Sierra de Alcatraz. But the cavalier, when not smoking the eternal cigarrito, strummed his guitar and sang all the love songs he knew. Mr. Moulton coughed and frowned and ordered Lydia to turn her back. But open remonstrance might have meant the flashing of knives, certainly the vociferating protest of female voices, for the car was crowded and the peasants were delighted with the concert. At Chinchilla, however, there was a diversion, and love moved rearward. A man leaped into the train. He wore a belt of 3 tiers, and each tier was stuck full of knives. Mrs. Moulton screamed, but he was immediately surrounded by the peasants, who snatched at the knives and bargained shamelessly. In a moment he thrust them aside, and, making his way to the strangers, protested that he had reserved his best for them, and flourished in their faces some of the finest specimens of Albacete, long curved blades of steel and long curved handles of ebony or ivory, inlaid with bits of coloured glass and copper. Catalina and Captain Over bought several at 1/3 of the price demanded. The Catalan had followed the huckster, and under Mr. Moulton's very nose he bought the longest and most deadly of the collection. After several playful thrusts at the vendor, and severing a lock of his hair, he thrust it conspicuously into his sash, and, with a lightning glance at poor Mr. Moulton, returned to his seat. Here it was evident that he related deeds of prowess. Once more he flourished the knife, and his audience uttered high staccato notes of approval. Chapter 11 of the Travelling Thirds by Gertrude Atherton. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. They arrived at Albacete before nightfall. It was too small a place for the omnibus, but several enterprising boys appropriated the hand luggage, and without awaiting instructions made for the one hotel of the Alto. This proved to be so far superior to the hotel of the small American town that it appeared palatial to the weary travellers. It stood, large and white and cool, on the Alameda, whose double row of plane trees formed an avenue down the middle of the long wide street. It is true the beds were not made, water appeared to be as precious as at the stations, and the servants as weak of head as of ambulatory muscle, but the rooms were large and lofty and clean, and the supper was eatable. Mrs. Moulton and Jane, after a brief ramble, sought what to both was become the end and aim of all travelling, bed and quiet, and Mr. Moulton, leaving the other 2 girls in charge of Over, soon followed their example. "I saw that scoundrel leave the train," he murmured, as he left Over at the foot of the staircase, "but he has gone off to the diversions of the new town, no doubt, and will be occupied for a few hours at least." The girls had wandered to the doorway and were looking out into the dark Alameda. Over exchanged a glance with Catalina and drew Lydia's hand through his arm. "Miss Shore is tired," he said, "but I am sure you will enjoy another stroll. At all events, don't leave me to moon by myself." And Lydia, flattered by the unusual attention, surrendered with her charming animation of word and feature. They walked beside the Alameda down to the quaint old plaza, surrounded by white houses of varied architecture, deserted and dimly lit with the infrequent lamp. When Englishmen are diplomatic they are the most subtle and sinuous of mankind, but when they are not they are the bluntest. Over said nothing whatever until he had enjoyed the half of his pipe, and then he remarked, "I say, you must drop that man. Send him about his business without any more loss of time." Lydia, who had been prattling amiably, stiffened and attempted to withdraw her arm. "What are my affairs to you?" she asked haughtily. "For this trip I am your big brother. I should not merit the friendship of your father if I did not make this affair my own. Brothers are always privileged to be rude, you know. You are not only playing a silly game, but a dangerous one. That man will try to kidnap you. He is only 1 degree removed from a bandit." Lydia's eyes flashed, and he hastened to rectify a possible misstep. "How would you like to live in the side of a hill with your lord, to escape taxes, and cook his frijoles 365 days of the year? If he didn't beat you, he certainly would not serenade you, and even in a country where water is more plentiful than in Spain, suppose you induced him to emigrate, it is doubtful if he would ever take a bath." "You are a brute!" "Merely practical. He would insist upon having his beans flavored with garlic, and he doubtless smokes all night as well as all day. He may be a good enough sort in the main, but there is no hope for a man to rise above his station in life. If there were a revolution he would probably be in the thick of it and get himself killed, and if he followed you to America, failing to kidnap you, he would probably open a cigar shop on the Bowery." He had expected tears, but Lydia drew herself up and said coldly, "I don't think I am in danger of being kidnapped. Strange as it may appear, I feel quite well able to take care of myself, and if with you on one side and father on the other, I can't vary the monotony of life with a little flirtation, well, if you were a girl surrounded by goody-goody people as I have always been, you might be tempted a little by something that had the glamour of romance." "Girls must find life rather a bore," said Over, sympathetically, "and I only wish your hero were worthy of you. But, take my word for it, his romantic picturesqueness is only skin, clothes deep. No man is romantic, if it comes to that. I met a long–haired poet once, and when we got him in the smoking–room, he was the prosiest of the lot." "There is no such thing as romance, then?" asked Lydia, with a sigh. "Not when you are up against it, to use a bit of your own slang." As the radiating streets were dark, they paced slowly about the plaza. For a time Lydia was silent, and Over drew thoughtfully at his pipe. Finally he asked curiously, "Do you women really get any satisfaction out of that sort of thing, talking with your eyes and exchanging an occasional note? I mean, of course, unless you have a definite idea that it is going to lead to something." "We like any little excitement," said Lydia, dryly, "and the littlest is better than none. I suppose you are too masculine, too British to understand that." "Well, yes, I am rather. I fancy what is the matter with girls is that they don't have to work as hard as boys, don't have so many opportunities to work off steam. As for this Johnny, he must be a silly ass if he is content with singing and sighing and rigging himself out. If he isn't, there lies the danger. He'll rally his friends and carry you off. Nothing could be simpler." "I should be quite like Helen, or Mary Queen of Scots." "Good Lord!" She flushed under the lash of his voice, but in a moment raised her eyes softly to his. "You are so good," she murmured, "really like a brother, so I don't mind telling you that I am fearfully interested, but not so much in the mere man as in the whole thing. It has all seemed so romantic, at least. I don't believe an American girl ever had such an experience before. However, I will set your mind at rest, since you are so good as to take an interest in poor little me. I haven't the slightest desire really to know the man. I should be disenchanted, of course, for I could not stand commonness in the most beautiful husk. But there is something in one quite independent of all that, of one's upbringing, one's prejudices, of common sense. Can't you understand? The primeval attraction of man and woman. I have been quite aware that all this could come to nothing, but it has been something to have felt that way for once, in a well-regulated lifetime. To have been primal for a fleeting moment is something, I can assure you." Over groped in the depths of his masculine understanding. "Well, I suppose so. But what of the man? It is a mere experience to you, but it may be a matter of life and death to a poor devil who is 9/10 fire and sentiment. He, too, has something to think about for the rest of his life." "And you fancy that will satisfy him?" "It will have to." "You might have spared him." "There can be no romance without a hero." "Upon my word, you are the greater savage of the two." "I told you I enjoyed being a savage for once in my life." Over made no reply, and if Lydia's glance had not dropped to the uneven pavement, she would have seen his eyes open wide with incredulous amazement, and then flash with anger. As it was, she wondered why he hurried her back to the hotel, and then practically ordered her up to her room. He stood on the lower step of the stair until he heard her greet Jane. Then he left the hotel and walked rapidly down the street again. In a moment he met Catalina. "Oh," he said, with an awkward attempt at masculine indifference, although his eyes were blazing. "Are you out—alone, as late as this? Isn't it rather risky?" "I've been walking with Jesus Maria," she replied coolly. "What a baby you were to walk off through these lonely streets with Lydia! I suppose, of course, that you would talk to her in the hotel. Don't you know that man would have been mad with jealousy if he had seen you? Then there would have been a fine rough and tumble if he hadn't got a knife into your back first. He came along with that everlasting guitar under his arm just after you left, and I told him that Lydia was ill, and asked him to take a walk with me. We'd better give him the slip as soon as possible. He's off his head about her." "What a little brick you are! What did he have to say?" "I explained to him that he could never hope to marry Lydia, and elevated the family to the ancient aristocracy of America. It made no impression on him whatever. He expressed contempt for the entire race, barring Lydia, whom he takes to be an angel. I concluded that disloyalty was the better part, and told him that Lydia was nothing but a little American flirt trying to have a sensation. That made even less impression on him. He believes that she is ready to fly with him at a moment's notice. I did more harm than good, and I shall speak to Cousin Lyman to-night." Over stared hard at her. "That was very brave of you. Aren't you afraid of anything?" "Not of greasers," replied the Californian. "I've dealt with them all my life. I treated this one as an equal, and made him forget Lydia in talking about himself. He's a revolutionist, hates the Queen because she doesn't go to bullfights, despises the King, anathematizes all monarchies and aristocracies, and talks like a Fourth of July orator about the days when Spain will be a republic, and one of his own sort, possibly himself, will be president. I never heard so much brag in America, but he's full of pluck. Now, you go and call Cousin Lyman out into the hall, and we'll have a consultation." Chapter 12 of the Travelling Thirds by Gertrude Atherton. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. The upshot of the conference was the decision that on the following morning the Moultons should conspicuously enter a third-class carriage of the train bound for Baeza, and while Captain Over, on the platform, talked with Catalina in the doorway, they should slip out of the opposite entrance, cross the track, and take the train for Alcazar. The Alcazar train, the landlord assured them, left 2 minutes earlier than that from Baeza. so that Catalina, in the confusion of the last moments, could join her relatives unobserved. It was the habit of Jesus Maria to saunter down late, and even then to engage in conversation on the platform. Catalina had told him they intended to spend the following night at Baeza, and he was under the impression they were bound for Seville. Captain Over would take Catalina's place in the doorway, covering her retreat, and await the rest of his party in Baeza. It was a programme little to the taste of any of them, but Over heroically proposed it, and it seemed to be the only feasible plan. In Spain there is apparently no law against crossing the tracks, nor in leaving a train on the wrong side. On the following morning, Catalina having reserved a first-class compartment on the train for Alcazar, the 6 members of the party, portmanteaus in hand, filed down to the station and entered a third-class carriage on the southern train. In a few moments Over descended leisurely and lit a cigarette. Catalina leaned forward to chat with him, then stood up, her bright, amused glances roving over the country people who were bound for a fair in a town near by. The peasants were interested in themselves and contemptuously indifferent to strangers. The Moultons, including the mystified and angry Lydia, descended and crossed the track unobserved. Catalina, one hand on her portmanteau, was ready to make a dash the moment she heard the familiar drone, "Viajeros al tren." It might be expected within the next 5 minutes, and it might be belated for 20. "There he comes," she murmured. "If he should take it into his head to enter the train before it starts! We will tell him the others are late. What a pity you don't speak Spanish. You could engage him in conversation. He is looking—glowering at me. Do you suppose he suspects?" "It is not like you to lose your nerve," began Over, but at the same moment his glance moved from the Catalan's face to hers, and he smiled. She looked, if anything, more impassive than usual. "My knees are shaking," she confided to him, "and my heart is galloping. It is rather delightful to be so excited, but still, thank Heaven!" Jesus Maria had met an acquaintance. They lit the friendly cigarito and entered into conversation. "They are walking down the platform," said Catalina, anxiously, a moment later, "and the other train is not so far back as this. However, Cousin Lyman will no doubt keep the door shut. There, he's turning. I'd better make a bolt. Good–bye, au revoir. Tell me again exactly what I am to do. I don't want to run any risk of missing you." Catalina glanced over her shoulder. There was such a babel, both in the car and on the platform, that it would not be difficult to miss the sing–song of the guard. The other train was still there. "Do not go to the town. It is miles from the station. There is sure to be an inn close by. If we don't arrive to–morrow night, of course, you will have a telegram. In any case, don't wait for us, but go on to Granada. You can amuse yourself there, and we are sure to turn up sooner or later. Have you that list of Spanish words I wrote out?" He looked forlorn and homesick, and Catalina laughed outright. "Better go straight to Granada," she said. "Viajeros al tren." "Take my place, quick," whispered Catalina. She let herself down on the other side, dragged her heavy bag after her, and ran. She had a confused idea that the northern train was closer than it had been, but did not pause until she came to the first–class carriages. Then she saw that the train was empty. At the same instant she heard a whistle, and glancing distractedly up the track, saw a train gliding far ahead. There was not a moment to be lost. It was the guard of the southern train that had announced his warning cry, and she ran back, dragging the heavy portmanteau—it held the day's lunch, among other things, and almost in tears. It had been an exciting morning, and she had slept little the night before. She stopped and gasped. The train was moving, slowly it is true, but far too rapidly for a person on the wrong side with a heavy piece of luggage. She dropped the portmanteau, and drawing a long breath, called with all the might of her lungs, long accustomed to the ranch cry, "Captain Over! Captain Over!" The door of a carriage was opened instantly. Over took in the situation at a glance, leapt to the ground and ran towards her, caught up the portmanteau, and regaining his compartment, flung it within. Catalina followed it with the agility of a cat, and in another moment they were panting opposite each other. Catalina fanned herself with her hat. She would not speak until she could command her voice. "How was anyone to know they would run another train between?" she said finally. "Poor Cousin Lyman, he must be frantic. Cousin Miranda, no doubt, is delighted. It is my fault, of course. No, it is yours. You should not have engaged me in conversation at the critical moment." "I will take the blame, and the best care of you besides." She was looking out of the window at the moment, and he glanced at her curiously. She was quite unembarrassed, and what he had dimly felt before came to him with the force of a shock. With all her intellect and her interest in many of the vital problems of life, she was as innocent as a child. She might not be ignorant, but she had none of the commonplace inquisitiveness and morbidness of youth, and he recalled that she had grown up without the companionship of other girls, had read few novels and little subjective literature of any sort. She had never looked younger, more utterly guileless than as she sat fanning herself slowly, her hair damp and tumbled, the flush of excitement on her cheek. Over felt as if he had a child in his charge, and drew a long breath of relief. He knew many girls who would have carried off the situation, but their very dignity would have been the signal of inner tribulation, and made him miserable. With Catalina he had but to have a care that she was not placed in a false position. And, after all, the time was short, and they were unlikely to meet anyone who even spoke the English language. She met his eyes, and they burst into laughter like two contented and naughty children. "I'm so happy to get rid of them, I can't contain myself," announced Catalina. "So are you, only you are too polite to say so. I could have done it on purpose, but I'm rather glad I failed through too much zeal. Do you understand, Lydia?" she asked abruptly. "I don't waste time trying to understand women," he replied cautiously. "I thought perhaps she confided in you last night. She has tried to unbosom herself to me, but I have not been sympathetic. I don't understand her. I am half a savage, I suppose, but I could go through life and never see a man like that." "I can't make out if she loves him." "Oh, love!" Catalina elevated her nose the higher, as the word gave her a vague thrill. "You can't be in love with a person you can't talk to, outside of poetry. Would you call that sort of thing love?" "No, I don't think I should. I fancy it is a mere arbitrary effort to feel romantic." She stood up suddenly and looked over the crowded car, then turned to Over with wide eyes. "He is not here," she said. "Doubtless he is in the next car, or he may have jumped off when he discovered the exodus." He searched the other cars when the train stopped again, and returned to report that Jesus Maria was missing. Catalina shrugged her shoulders. "We did our best," she said, "and I, for one, am not going to bother. We'll have them again soon enough." The great sun–burned dusty plains were behind them to–day, and the train toiled upward through tremendous gorges, brown, barren, the projecting ledges looking as if they had just been rent asunder, so little had time done to soften them. In the defiles were villages or solitary houses, poor for the most part. Now and again a turn of the road closed the perspective with a line of snow peaks. The air was clear and cool. There was little dust. Their car gradually gave up its load, until by lunch–time only one man was left, and he gratefully accepted of their superfluous store. He looked, this old Iberian, like the aged men who sit in the cabin–doors in Ireland. The same long self–satisfied upper lip, the small cunning eyes, the narrow head of the priest–ridden race. He had done nothing, learned nothing, in his 70, braced himself passively against a modern innovation, and could be cruel when his chance came to him. He cared no more for what the priests could not tell him than he cared that Spain could not make the wretched engines that drew her trains. On the whole, no doubt, he was happy. At all events, he was extremely well–bred, and took no liberty that he would not have resented in another. But Catalina forgot him in the grand and forbidding scene, and she leaned out of the window so recklessly that more than once Over, as if she were a child, put his hand on her shoulder and drew her in. He began dimly to understand that Catalina had something more than the mere love of nature and appreciation of the beautiful common enough in the higher civilization. She tried, but not very successfully, to express to him that the vague desire to personify great mountains, the trees, and the sea, which haunts imaginative minds, the deathless echo of prehistoric ancestors whose only revenge it is upon time, was doubly inconsistent in one so recently allied to the tribe of Chinigchinich, whose roots were in Asia. Of immemorial descent, with the record in her brain, perhaps, of those ancestors who personified and worshipped the phenomena of nature before the evolution of that first priesthood on the Ganges and the Euphrates, the Nile and the Indus, she had rare moments of primal exaltation. It is a far cry from those marvellous first societies and the vast orderly and complicated civilization, worshipping mysterious and unseen gods, that followed them, to the Chinigchinich Indians of Alta California, and yet, crushed, conquered, almost blotted out, these remnants in their very despair reverted the more closely to nature. The beautiful Carmela was the child of mission Indians who fled back to their mountain pueblos and savage rites when the power of the priests in California was broken. Every inherited instinct had waged war against the Christianity which, in 9 cases out of 10, was pounded into them with green-hide riata. They called the child Carmela, after the mission of Carmel, merely because they liked the name. But she grew up a pagan, and a pagan remained during the few years of her life. And she was as pure and good, as loyal and devoted, as any of the women descended from her, heedful of the wild inheritance in their blood lest it poison the strong and bitter tide of New England ancestors. Catalina was the first to feel pride in that alien strain which did so much to distinguish her from the million, and was conscious that she owed to it her faculty to see and feel more in nature than the average Anglo-Saxon. Over, in the almost empty car, lit by a solitary and smoking lamp, listened attentively as she groped her way through the mysterious labyrinths in her brain, expressing herself ill, for she was little used to egotistical ventures. It cannot be said that he understood, being himself a typical product of the extremest civilization that extends in the world to day, but he saw will-o'-the-wisps in a fog-bank, and thought her more interesting than ever. Chapter 13 of the Travelling Thirds by Gertrude Atherton. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. The train was 2 hours late. It crawled into the dark little station of Baeza, and Over and Catalina sat down at once in the restaurant, leaving the problem of the night until later. But, hungry as the Englishman was, that problem dulled the flavour of the fair repast. How was he to protect the girl from curiosity and speculation, possibly coarse remark; above all, from self–consciousness? It would be assumed at the inn, as a matter of course, that they were a young couple, and he turned cold as he pictured the landlord conducting them upstairs to the usual room with a bed in each corner. He heartily wished it was he who spoke the Spanish language, and that his companion was afflicted with his own distracting ignorance; but he must interpret through her, and to discuss the matter with her beforehand was, to him, impossible. For the first time he wished she were with the Moultons in Alcazar. Catalina did not share his embarrassment. With her hat pulled low that she might attract the less attention, she was eating her dinner with the serenity of a child. As he seemed indisposed to conversation, she did not utter a word until the salad was placed beside them, and then she met his disturbed and roving eye. "You are looking fearfully tired," she said, smiling. "While you are drinking your coffee I will go and talk to that man behind the counter, and see what can be done about to–night. You look as if you ought to be in bed this minute." "Ah!" He was taken aback, and still helpless. "I must ask you not to talk to any one unless I am with you. They would never understand. We had better cut the dessert and the coffee, and secure what rooms there may be. I suppose most of these people are going on, but a few may remain."
They went together to pay their score, and Catalina asked the functionary behind the counter if there were rooms above for travellers. He replied, with the haughty indifference of the American hotel clerk, that there were not. She demanded further information, and he merely shrugged his shoulders, for it is the way of the Spaniard to know no man's business but his own. But Catalina stood her ground, told him she would stand it till dawn, or follow him home; and finally, overcome by her fluency in invective, he unwillingly parted with the information that behind the station across the road there was a small inn above a cantina. "I am halfway sorry we did not leave a message for Mr. Moulton and go on," said Over, as they stood in the inky darkness and watched the train pull out of the station. "Probably, however, he would never have got it. Well, there is nothing to do but make the best of it." They crossed the sandy road, guided by the glimmer of the cantina. Here they found the host serving two men that would have put the Guardia Civile on the alert. He greeted the strangers politely, however, and called his wife. She came in a moment, smiling and comely, followed by a red-haired girl holding a candle. Catalina, warned by her recent interview, uttered a few of the flowery amenities that should lead up to any request in Spain. The woman, beaming with good-will, took the candle from her daughter's hand, motioned to the girl to take the portmanteaus, and, without apology for her humble lodgings, piloted them out into the dark, through another doorway, and up a rickety stair. Over, feeling as if he were being led out to be shot by the enemy, saw his worst fears verified. She threw open the door of a tiny blue-washed room, and there were the two little beds, the more conspicuous as they were uncompanioned but for a tiny washing-stand. It opened upon a balcony, and despite the bareness, it was so clean and inviting it seemed to make a personal appeal not to be judged too hastily. Over was unable to articulate, but Catalina said serenely, "We wish 2 rooms, señora." "Two!" cried the woman, and Over understood both the word and the expression of profound amazement. "Yes, 2." There was no voluble explanation from Catalina. She looked the woman straight in the eyes and repeated, "2 rooms, and quickly, please. We are very tired." The woman's eyes were wide with curiosity, but before Catalina's her tongue lost its audacity. She replied promptly enough, however, "But I have no other. It is only by the grace of God I have this. The train was late, the diligences were put away for the night, there were many, and my house is small. I see now the señor is a señorita's brother, but for one night, what matter?" Catalina turned to Over. "There is no other room," she said. Over went into the apartment, and lifting a mattress and coverings from one of the beds, returned to the hall and threw them on the floor. "I shall be comfortable here," he said curtly, glad of any solution. "Go to bed. I prefer this, anyhow, for I didn't like the looks of those men downstairs. Good night." "Good night," said Catalina, and she went into the room and closed the door. "The English are all mad," said the woman, and she went to find a candle for the hallway guest. It is doubtful if either Over or Catalina ever slept more soundly, and the bandits, if bandits they were, went elsewhere to forage. At dawn Catalina was dressed and hanging over the balcony, watching the retreating stars. She heard a mattress doubled and flung into a corner. The room was in order. She flashed past Over and down the stairs. "Go in and dress," she called back. "There is plenty of water, for a wonder." And he answered, "Stay in front of the window, where I could hear you if you called." Early as it was, the woman and her brood were in the kitchen at the back of the house, and she agreed to supply bread and cream for breakfast and make a tortilla for the travellers' lunch. Over came down in a few moments with his coffee-pot and lamp, and they had their breakfast on a barrel-top in front of the inn, as light-heartedly as if embarrassment had never beset them. Life begins early in Spain, notwithstanding its reputed predilection for the morrow, and as they finished breakfast several rickety old diligences drew up between the inn and the station. There were no passengers for the 3 little towns, and Over and Catalina went in one of the diligences to Baeza, 12 miles distant.
They spent a happy and irresponsible day roaming about the dilapidated 16th-century town, and divided their tortilla out in the country in the great shadow of the Sierra Nevada. They retained their spirits over the rough and dusty miles of their return, but lost them suddenly as they approached the station. The train, however, was 3 hours late this evening, and they philosophically dismissed the Moultons and enjoyed their dinner. They lingered over the sweets and coffee, then paced up and down the platform, the Englishman smoking and feeling like a truant schoolboy. Nevertheless, he was not sorry that the end of the intimacy approached. The results of propinquity might ofttimes be casual, but that mighty force was invariably loaded with the seeds of fate, and he knew himself as liable to love as any man. With the oddest and most enigmatic girl he had ever met, who allured while striving to repel, as devoid of coquetry as a boy or a child, yet now and then revealing a glimpse of watchful femininity, to whom nature had given a well-nigh perfect shell, and thrown upon his protection in long days of companionship, he summed it up curtly over his pipe: "I should make an ass of myself in a week." He had had no desire to marry since the days of his more susceptible youth. He was now 34, and although rich girls had made no stronger appeal to him than poor girls, he was well aware that the dowerless beauty was not for him. He was too good a soldier and too much of a man to be luxurious in taste or habit, and although a guardsman, he was born into the out-of-door generation that has nothing in common with the scented lap-dogs made famous by the novelists of the mid-Victorian era. But when not at the front he indulged himself in liberty, many hours at cricket and golf, the companionship of congenial spirits, a reasonable amount of dining out, and an absolute freedom from the petty details of life. Travelling third class amused him, the English aristocrat being the truest democrat in the world and wholly without snobbery. Single, his debts worried him no more than bad weather in London, but married, he must at once set up an establishment suited to his position. He had distinguished himself in South Africa, and his county, rich and poor, had, upon his return at the very end of the war, met him at the station and pulled his carriage over the miles to his father's house, some 2,000 men and women cheering all the way. There had been so many in London to lionize since that war, to which pampered men had gone in their heyday and returned grey and crippled, that when he went up for the season he was merely one of a galaxy, eagerly sought and fêted. But life had never slipped along so easily and pleasantly, and after 3 years of hardship and many months of painful illness, it had made a double appeal to a battered soldier, still half an invalid. He had dismissed the serious things of life as he landed in England, and devoutly hoped for a 5 years' peace. Therefore he was the less inclined to fall in love, valuing peace of mind no less than surcease for the body. Catalina was by no means penniless, and certainly would make a heroic soldier's wife, but they had not a tradition in common, and he saw clearly that if he loved her at all he should love her far more than had suited his indolent habit when not soldiering. Hence he welcomed the return of the Moultons, and even meditated a retreat. "A moon in the Alhambra would finish me," he thought, glancing up at the waxing orb fighting its way through a stormy mass of black and silver. A bell rang, a whistle, the only energetic thing about a Spanish train, shrieked and blustered above the slowing headlight of an engine approaching from the north. "You stand here by the thirds, and I'll go up to where the firsts will stop," began Catalina, but Over held her arm firmly within his. "No," he said peremptorily, "you must not be by yourself a moment in this crowd. You will be spoken to, probably jostled at once, and no doubt a rough lot will get out. We will both stand here by the restaurant door." "I am not afraid," said Catalina, haughtily. "That is not the point." "I was near coming to Spain by myself." "What has that to do with me?" She gave a little growl, and attempted to free herself by a sudden wrench, but he held her, and she stood sullenly beside him as the train wandered in and gave up its load. In a few moments she had forgotten her grievance and stared at him with expanded eyes. "Let us go to the telegraph office," he said. "Mr. Moulton must have sent a message." But at the office there was naught but the official and the cigarito and polite indifference. "They missed the train, that goes without saying," said Over. "They are sure to arrive in the morning, I should think, and they can travel comfortably enough at night, first class. Will you ask what time the morning train arrives?" It was due nearly an hour before the train would leave for Granada. "You will hear your Nightingales to morrow evening," said Over, cheerfully. "The Moultons will never stay here all day." With this assurance they parted, Over sleeping in another little blue washed room. The entire fonda had been reserved for the Moultons. And the next morning they drank their coffee from the barrel top, while their kind and now indifferent landlady made tortillas for the party. The train arrived on time, and without the Moultons. In the telegraph office the gentleman of leisure was still smoking, but after inquiring indolently into Over's name and rank, and demanding to see his cards and correspondence, he produced a telegram. It read: "Toledo, Hotel Castilla, Moulton." "Toledo!" cried Catalina. "I want to go to Granada. That's what I came to Spain for. If they go north that far they won't come south again. They will take the steamer at Genoa. I won't go." "It is by no means certain they won't return. It is only a matter of a day. Doubtless they are still dodging Jesus Maria. I think we had better join them. It is useless to expect explanations by wire. Granada can wait a few days, and Toledo, in its way, must be quite as interesting." "Well, I'll soon find out," announced his companion. Chapter 14 of the Travelling Thirds by Gertrude Atherton. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14 During the journey to Toledo, Catalina stared sulkily out of the window or slept with her head against the side of the car. She ignored Over's attempts to converse until, with chilling dignity, he retired to the opposite end of the compartment and wondered how he could have thought of love in connection with a bad-tempered child. He was delighted at the prospect of reunion with the orthodox Moultons, and understood something of their serene contempt for originality. It is true that Catalina asleep, with the deep vermilion on her cheeks, her tumbled head drooping, looked so innocent and lovely that she set him to wondering regretfully why there was no such thing as perfection in woman. And from thence it was but a step to imagine Catalina with the qualities and training that would make her the ideal of man. There was no harm in indulging one's self in idyllic imagining, by way of variety, Over concluded. Doubtless it was good for the soul. Whatever the motive, his imagination performed unaccustomed feats during the drowsy afternoon, while his companions slept, and the other occupants of the car, few in number, smoked and said little. It pictured Catalina 10 years hence. She would then be 33, an age he had always found sympathetic in woman. She would have seen the world, have adapted herself to many new conditions, and in the process learned self-control, pared off the jagged edges of her egoism, and supplemented her beauty with a distinction of manner and style that would compel the homage of the best societies of the world. He had seen what she was capable of, and he suspected that she was ambitious. It was her love of solitude and dislike of mere men and women that had swathed her so deeply in her crudities. But if she carried out her intention of living for some years in England and Europe, and cultivated the right sort of people, the transformation was almost certain. Perhaps it would be worth while to ask his mother to take care of her in England. Lady Peggy Over was a clever, warm-hearted woman of the simple, old-fashioned aristocracy, who offered her sons no assistance in choosing their wives, and had the broadest tolerance for the vagaries of young people. With her lively mind and humour she would win upon Catalina at once, and her complete honesty of nature would finish the conquest of a girl whose hatred of sham was almost fanatical. Catalina opened her eyes upon him, half awake, and he asked her impulsively, "What is your ambition? What do you want?" She answered sleepily, but without hesitation, "To have 4 children." He was too astonished to speak for a moment. Then he asked feebly, "Is that all?" "No," she said, now quite awake. "I want to meet all the most interesting people in the world, and read the most interesting books, and show a lot of other people what frauds and useless creatures they are. But I love children as much as I detest most people, and I'll never be contented till I have 4. I don't see why you look so dumbfounded. What is there so remarkable in wanting children?" "Oh, nothing," he said soothingly. "Perhaps we can see Toledo in a moment." Mr. Moulton met them at the station. His face was flushed and his manner perturbed, but he shook their hands cordially and protested that he had never been so glad to lay eyes on anyone. "Let us walk up," said Catalina, and she strode on ahead. The men followed, Mr. Moulton talking with nervous volubility. "Of course I did not blame you, my dear Catalina," he reiterated. "Such a contretemps in Spain is easy enough. Mrs. Moulton is still a little upset, but you know what—invalids are, and I beg you to be patient. It won't worry me in the least. But why this change of front? Why didn't you come to Baeza?" "That wretched peasant saw us as I was craning my neck looking for you, and reached the train in 3 bounds. Of course we were safe in the first–class carriage, and at Alcazar I had a brilliant idea. We drove to the hotel as usual, with all our baggage, and that mountebank—I shall never pronounce his impious name—supposed we were settled for the night. After dinner I told the landlord, through the kind medium of a Frenchman who spoke both English and Spanish, that being much annoyed by this creature, we had determined to change our itinerary and go direct to Madrid, where we could call upon our minister to protect us. We then took the night train, and were under way a good hour before it was time for the man to appear with his guitar. I even bought tickets for Madrid, and as we changed cars at midnight we were practically unobserved. We are very comfortable, and are in time for a grand fête." "How is Lydia?" Catalina asked dryly. "The poor child is very nervous, but most thankful to be rid of the man. By the way, I telegraphed as soon as I arrived in Toledo." "This is Spain," said Over. The hint of Mrs. Moulton's displeasure had fallen on heedless ears. They were crossing the Alcantara bridge that leads through the ancient gateway of the same name up to one of the most beautiful cities to look upon the world. Toledo, the lofty outpost of the range of mountains behind the raging Tagus, is an almost perpendicular mass of rock on all sides but one, its uneven plateau crowded with palaces and churches, tiny plazas and narrow winding streets, a mere roof of tiles from the Alcazar, which stands on its highest point, but from below a wild yet symmetrical outcropping of the rock itself. Founded, so runs the legend, by a son of Noah, certainly the ancient capital of the Goths, and the scene of much that was terrible and romantic in their history, a stronghold of the Moors, who left here, as elsewhere, their indelible imprint, and later of the sovereigns of Castile, equally inaccessible from the Vega and the defile of the Tagus. It was one of the most impregnable cities in history, so long as man was left to dispute the gates on a steep road rising from the plain. It is to–day a sarcophagus of ancient history, compact, isolated, little disturbed by the outer world, yet with an intense and vivid life of its own. Catalina hung over the bridge and stared down into the rocky gorge where the river had torn its way, and soldiers of every nation of the ancient world had been hurled, cursing and shrieking and praying, from the beetling heights above. Impervious to Mr. Moulton's kindly hints, she led them through the old streets of the Moors, streets so narrow they were obliged to walk like stalking Indians, but with beautiful old balconied houses on either side, and glimpses of luxurious patio within, not pausing before the broad grey front of the hotel until the trio of cousins had awaited her some 50 minutes. Mrs. Moulton was so far the reverse of a cruel and vicious woman that she had been, for the good of her soul, too amiable and self-sacrificing for at least 30 years of her life. Not fine enough to have developed loveliness of character, there had, perhaps, been too few opportunities for reaction, or, if occurring, they had been conscientiously stifled. A good woman, but not of the most distinguished fibre. The effacement of self for the few she loved had been but a higher order of selfishness, and when, for the first time in her life, a positive hatred possessed her, it found her without that greatness which ignores and foregoes revenge. Catalina, it must be confessed, would have tried the patience of far more saintly characters than Mrs. Moulton, and when to a natural antipathy was added the daily jarring of long–tried nerves, the wonder was that the crisis did not come sooner. But Mrs. Moulton was accustomed to self–control, and to the exercise of the average amount of Christianity. Moreover, she had her standards of conduct, and held all exhibitions of feeling to be vulgar. Therefore, in spite of her growing and morbid desire to humble Catalina, she might have forborne to force an issue, and perhaps, had circumstances favoured the alien, have grimly, however unwillingly, triumphed once more over self. But these last days had unravelled her nerves. To passionate sympathy for her pale and persecuted daughter, misled in the first instance by the daily example of a barbarian, had recently been added a night of hideous discomfort, when, not one of the four speaking a language but their useless own, and without the invaluable Baedeker, they had fled from a ridiculous peasant, changing trains at midnight, waiting hours at way–stations, arriving at Toledo in the grey cold dawn, hungry, worried, exhausted, to find neither omnibus nor cab at the station. As Mrs. Moulton toiled up the steep road through the carven gates of terrible and romantic memory, she had heartily wished that modern enterprise had blown up the rock with dynamite, or run an elevator from the Tagus. It was then that her hatred of Catalina, who, at least with her knowledge of foreign languages, had been an acceptable courier, became an obsession, and she could have shrieked it out like an uncommon virago. The emotional wave had receded, but left a dark and poisonous deposit behind. It was easy to convince herself that Catalina had lost the train at Albacete on purpose. When her husband had received Captain Over's telegram, she had assumed that the Englishman had persuaded the girl to return, eager, no doubt, to be rid of her. She was not prone to think evil, and had one of her daughters or the approved young women of her circle been left with a young man at the way–station for 2 days and nights, she might have given way to nerves, but never to suspicion. But as the crowning iniquity of the author of her downfall, it gave her the opportunity she had coveted, and she burned to take advantage of it. When Catalina finally announced herself, Mrs. Moulton was standing in the middle of her bedroom, and Jane was reading by the window. The latter nodded as the prodigal entered, and returned to her book. "Well," said Catalina, amiably, "how are you all? I'm glad you are rid of the peasant at last. Where is Lydia?" She paused, blinking under the cold glare of Mrs. Moulton's eyes. "What is the matter?" she asked, haughtily. "Cousin Lyman said you were angry, but you must have known how I was left. I'm sorry you didn't have Baedeker with you." This was an unusual concession for Catalina, but something in the bitter and contemptuous face made her vaguely uneasy. "You were left on purpose," said Mrs. Moulton, deliberately. Catalina made a quick step forward, the breath hissing through her teeth. She looked capable of physical violence, but Mrs. Moulton continued in the same cold, even tones. "You remained behind in order to be alone with Captain Over for 2 days and nights. You are not fit to associate with my daughters. You are a wicked, abandoned creature, and I refuse—I absolutely refuse—to shelter your amours. If you appeal to my husband, I shall tell him to choose between us." Catalina fell back, staring. Innocent she might be, but not ignorant. It was impossible to mistake the woman's meaning, and in a flash she understood that by the evil–minded, evil might be read into her adventure. It was then, however, that she showed herself thoroughbred. Her anger left her as abruptly as it had come. She drew herself up, bowed impersonally, and left the room. Mrs. Moulton, trembling, sank into her chair, and Jane, protesting that her parent had behaved like an empress, fetched the aromatic salts; but Mrs. Moulton, having unburdened her hate, had parted with its sustaining power, and was flat and cowed by the reaction. "Does it pay?" she demanded again and again. "Does it pay?" CHAPTER XV